Hi, I'm Dylan Sussman, like she said, I'm from the firm Dodson & Flinker. We're a planning and landscape architecture firm from Northampton, Massachusetts. Very happy to be here in this beautiful part of the state tonight. Peter Flinker, my boss, is here with us tonight, as well as Nate Burgess and Helena Farrell. Will be facilitating stations with you later. I'm going to start with a presentation. How many of you either went to the meeting last week or reviewed the presentation from that? Okay, so some of you, this will be new to, so I will go through the beginning part of this presentation, which is a review of what we did last week. It doesn't have all the details that we covered last week, so feel free after this meeting to check out the town website, which has the full presentation on it, with all the nuts and bolts and details and confusing things about the MBTA Communities Law. So, as I said, we're going to have a presentation. After the presentation, we're going to have a brief Q&A, and I mean brief because we want to get to the stations. So it's really just for clarifying questions, technical questions. It's really not intended for a time for comments and opinions. We can save that for the groups. We do that because when we divide into groups, it gives everybody more time to talk. So if one person talks, if we have 60 minutes, 60 people each get 1 minute. If we divide into 4 groups, each get 15 minutes or something like that. That's some bad math. Each get 4 minutes. Okay, so Q&A, we're going to do the design exercise, which will take about an hour and a half, and then we'll come back together for a report out and a full group discussion. The scope of this project is basically to develop zoning for the town that will be compliant with the state's MBTA Communities Law, which is Section 3 of Chapter 48, which is the Zoning Enabling Act. Our approach to this kind of zoning project is to first figure out what the town wants in a physical way. So doing physical planning, doing visioning for actual sites, and then writing zoning that reflects that plan, what you want. So last week we looked at some existing conditions analysis and some maps. Those maps are over there on the wall for you to look at, and I'm going to run through them tonight. Tonight we're going to look at specific sites and talk about what you think fits there, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, and why. Out of that, we hope to identify some potential districts and develop some concept plans for those districts, and then eventually develop zoning for the districts based on the concept plans. So I'm going to describe to you the basics of the MBTA Communities Law. It's a state law that basically applies to 177 communities. West Newbury is one of those. Even though you don't have an MBTA station in your community, you're adjacent to one. So you're called an adjacent small community, and you're subject to the law. There are different types of, different requirements for different sizes of communities and whether you have a rapid transit station or not. You're sort of in the lowest tier, which means the requirements are numerically the least onerous. But for a small town, it's potentially going to change. So the law requires that your town have at least one zoning district that allows multifamily housing by right, and that the minimum density that's allowed is 15 units per acre. So if somebody has a 1 acre lot, they can build 15 multifamily units on that 1 acre lot by right. That's what the MBTA, we're going to save questions until the end of the presentation. So it's going to be a long presentation, so you might need to write down the questions. So 15 units per acre by right. Multifamily housing is defined as a building with 3 or more units, or 2 buildings on a single lot, each of which has 2 or more units. So it's basically 3 units in a single building on 1 lot, or 4 units in 2 buildings on a single lot. For adjacent small towns like yours, you're required to zone for 5% of your current housing units. You have 1,740 housing units in your town, so 5% of that, you're required to zone for a minimum of 87 multifamily housing units. When you do the math at 15 units per acre, it means at a minimum you need to zone 500 acres up to what's called developable land. You could choose to zone for more than that, or you could choose to zone at a higher density and zone for less than that. Anybody lost yet? Everybody with me? Okay, so as I said, it has to be 5.8 acres of what's called developable land. So you can't just zone all your wetlands and say, yeah, we're done, we did it, because obviously nobody can develop on that. So the state is, not letting you get past that. So developable lands are private parcels that don't meet their criteria for excluded lands, which are the things that are shown here. So lands under wetland, lands that are within Title V setbacks, or septic setbacks, or surface protection zone A, water protection zone A. Land that's within right of way, so you can't zone your streets. Most public lands and permanently protected open space are all things that are considered excluded lands. If you put your zoning district over those things, they're going to get deducted out of what the state counts. So if you zone a parcel that's 10 acres and it has 5 acres of the wetlands, only 5 acres will count toward your minimum criteria for the state. And they have this handy dandy compliance tool, which is a combination of a spreadsheet and mapping that we're going to use later on in the process to check and make sure that your zoning is compliant. The other thing to know about excluded land is that most town-owned land is also excluded according to the state's guidelines. The exception to that is land that the town has already designated as suitable for housing through their housing production plan. So we're going to talk about the Mullen property later. That's an example of a property that's been designated in the town's housing production plan, and so therefore is kosher. The other opportunity is that the town is like pretty far along in disposition of property, selling it to a developer, so forth, and then you can count that kind of land as well. But for the most part, we're looking for private parcels that are free of physical constraints. So this is about zoning. It's not about the town being forced to build affordable housing itself. It's about the town being required to change its zoning to allow private developers to build housing if they so choose. So it requires, the first step is you got to change the zoning, and then for housing to actually result from it, there has to be a property owner who wants to develop housing and has the means to develop housing and has the financing to develop housing and so on, and can actually make a project work on their site, right? They can make all the numbers work. So it's not about the town being required to develop housing. It's also not about the town being required to make infrastructure improvements. So you have public water supply in part of your town. You do not have any public wastewater. So as I'm sure all of you have private septic systems here in the room, you live in West Newbury. So that's a major constraint on development. And in many cases, on probably every parcel in West Newbury, it's very, very difficult to get 15 units per acre on a septic system. The state recognizes that, so when you're being required to change the zoning, the development that results from that may be less than 15 units per acre because it's just physically impossible to do that on a site with a septic system, unless somebody spends a lot of money and does a full-blown wastewater treatment plant. So if the town says, we don't want to do this, there are consequences. The consequences are that you lose access to grant programs, the most significant of which is MassWorks, which is one of the state's major infrastructure grant programs. The Attorney General issued an advisory in March that said there will be civic enforcement actions potentially if towns don't comply, and that you're also liable for under state and federal fair housing laws. So those are some reasons to comply. Okay, I'm going to walk through the maps we showed last time just to get you sort of oriented to how we got to where we are tonight. So we did some mapping where we looked at all of the physical constraints in the town based on available GIS data from the state and other sources. You get a map that kind of looks like a big bruise here, showing you areas in pink that have a pretty high chance of flooding, 1% chance of flooding every year, wetlands, rivers, streams, soils that are not so great for, soils that are basically wet, are not going to hurt, and also slopes and ground, or slopes that are very steep. Those are useful to know because they can make it difficult to access parcels instead of back on parcel. There might be a lot of land in a parcel, it's basically inaccessible due to the slopes. We also looked at regulatory constraints, so things like the 200-foot river protection area, 100-foot wetland buffers, permanently protected open space, and then areas where there's potentially rare species habitat. And we looked at parcels that we think are probably pretty unlikely to be developed because of the current use or the size of the lot. So in shades of red here are small parcels. So in the deep red are parcels that are less than an acre, and in the lighter red are parcels that are between 1 and 5 acres. So with a 1 acre lot, it's very difficult with a septic system to get 15 units per acre. And also, it's pretty unlikely that somebody who has a 1 acre lot would want to build multifamily housing for less than. With 1 to 5 acres, it's maybe possible, but it's going to be very difficult. And then other colors here are indicating things like town-owned land in yellow, or condominium complexes in purple. So tough to get a whole group of condominium complex owners to all agree to build more units on the condominium. And then things like electric transmission right-of-ways. When you add all of those together, so they've all been overlaid and they've all been turned gray in this map. So the gray areas are areas that seem like they'd be unlikely or unsuitable for multifamily housing. The yellow and the brown are outside of constraints and with lots that are between 1 acre to 5 acres in the sort of orange and greater than 5 acres in the yellow. So these are the areas that we think are potentially possible for the zoning districts. Seem reasonable for the zoning districts. We looked at those last time. We talked about them with the people who came to the meeting last week. For this meeting, we've narrowed it down to looking at 4 different locations. So the Mullen property, which is a town-owned site, the Dunn property, which is a private site, and the Knapp greenhouse, as well as what was called our previous planned town center development area. So just looking at the town center in general, we're thinking, is this an appropriate place for multifamily housing? And how, if it is, how can we make that work? So our stations tonight are going to cover, we have one station that's going to cover the town center. We have 2 stations that are modeling, and that will look at the Dunn property, the Knapp, and the Mullen property. And then we have another station that's talking about design preferences in general. Okay, so this is showing you an overlap of, in purple, all the areas that are excluded by the state, as well as sensitive lands according to the state, and then the gray are additional sort of undesirable and unlikely sites as well. So the town center. We're talking about the town center tonight because, as I said, it was identified in previous plans as a potential place in the town where you could have something different and better. So it was identified in the 2004 community development plan. It was identified in an open space and recreation plan at one point. It was identified by the regional planning area agency as a priority development area. So lots of people have looked at it and said, hey, maybe there's some possibilities here. In 2018, there was a study of centralized sewage treatment in the town center. So that's looked at this orange boundary. Sorry. Yeah, this is the orange boundary was the centralized sewage treatment plant area. That's not key there, sorry about that. The blue was the proposed overlay from the 2004 plan, and the pink is your current town center business district. So we're going to look roughly at this area and ask whether there are legs to this idea of town center. And in particular, this issue of wastewater treatment is really crucial. So the town center has a lot of small lots with older septic systems on them. It's difficult in some cases for those people to get septic systems that comply. It's difficult for businesses to expand or for new businesses to locate there due to the wastewater limitations. So there are two ways of permitting wastewater in Massachusetts. Title V is private septics and small shared septics up to 10,000 gallons per day. Once you go beyond 10,000 gallons per day, you get into full-blown wastewater treatment plants. Very expensive and requires, a lot more development to make it viable to do that. So you can get up to approximately 90 bedrooms on a Title V system. So if you have 45 two-bedroom units, you might just be able to get under that limit, right? So you're looking for 87 units. So potentially you're looking at two different projects under Title V. If they can hit the maximum, you get 45 and 45, gets you to 90, just over 87 units. If you wanted to revitalize your town center, or if you wanted to do some development that actually used some of the lots along Main Street, some of the smaller existing lots along Main Street, and doing smaller scale multifamily houses, a unit here, a unit there, as opposed to zoning for larger projects, you probably need some sort of shared wastewater treatment system to make that possible. So this is the Mullen site, and I'm showing you this just because, well, we're going to talk about it later tonight, but in 2009, the town looked at the Mullen site and they assessed the septic capability and capacity of the site, and they basically came up with a potential number of units of 40 on a 34-acre site. So about 1.16 units per acre. Okay, so this is a site that has relatively good soils, at least in part of it, for septic. It's on the better end for your town. And what was possible here was about a little over 1 unit per acre. So the state is saying zone for 15 units per acre. The reality is somewhere between 15 units per acre and 1 unit per acre. And wastewater treatment is the crucial factor there. I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who's going to walk through the Mullen site, tell you a little bit about that, as well as the other sites, and then show you some examples of development.
All right, so it seems like the sites with good access to Main Street makes sense because of that access, but also those tend to be the sites which have better soils and topography is not quite so steep and lumpy as it is elsewhere in the town. So for the purpose of this exercise tonight, we're really going to be focusing on 3 of those sites, including the Mullen property, which Dylan just showed you the previous plan for that. This is interesting because it's sort of right behind Main Street. There's somebody was talking earlier about the pattern of these big federal houses that are so gorgeous lined up along the street. And then you have this parcel going back behind them. And then I was looking at some old photographs from the 1930s, and this was all open field up to the point where it drops off and gets really steep. Right up probably into the 50s or 60s. that was still pretty open. So one of the key questions for this site is, do we want to bring, if we're going to develop this, do we want to bring that up and make it an extension of the development along Main Street and sort of make this one continuous village? Or do we want to put it in the back where nobody's going to see it? And how could that be arranged? So that's why the model pieces are really helpful, because you can see that, well, here's how a building fits on that site. In a way you can't even with pen and paper. So we're hoping you have some fun with that. We visited this last month, beautiful long alley going back to the site, and some of the beautiful buildings along Main Street. And then you get back and there's the remains of the original field, access to some of the trails, and sort of looking straight south is just trees, as you know. But again, a really interesting relationship of the older homes to Main Street. And again, the question is, do we somehow try to integrate that new project better with Main Street and make it kind of this continuous pedestrian district, or do we try to make a loop with the buildings in the back and so on? The second site we're looking at is sort of the Dunn Greenhouse property, 15 acres, quite a bit smaller, but also has a very close relationship to Main Street with the original. This is looking from the opposite direction. You see the churches on the opposite side of the street, and then you see the original greenhouse operation up there. But what's interesting here is there's quite a steep hill. There's a driveway that wraps around the hill, provides access, and that would work. We checked the grades, it would work if you improved that from the road. And then you have all this land which is relatively out of sight. So again, the question is, do we try to make this something that's an extension, an enhancement of the village perhaps? Could you have some shops or office space down by the street, apartments above them? And then what do you do with that backland? So one of the questions with each of these is what really needs to be protected of these sites? And if you want to develop part of it, which part would be the best for development? So that visually, it sort of impacts on wetlands and so on. And also opportunities for creating what we hope is a really wonderful community. We hope that for every project, right? Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't. So this again is a really interesting relationship to the street where you have this tight buildings right up to the sidewalk, which really gives you that sense of, this is kind of an image of West Newbury, right? Driving down the Main Street, these beautiful old buildings, and then looking up into the open spaces. In this case, you can't really see into the site directly because of the greenhouses. Across the street, you have the beautiful churches. And then we have the image looking at the field, but maybe not. Anyway, the third site is the Nat greenhouse property, 19 acres. And this one, there's, again, the greenhouse is close to the street. There's some fields and then quite a few wetlands, probably a third, more than a third of the site is wetlands as you go in the back. So this is 2017. This is just last month. And so again, you have kind of a steep hill going up with a view of the field. You have the old greenhouses and a beautiful patch of trees with the house there. And so you see the greenhouse operation, the yard, the old house, and oh yeah, this is the view from the street up onto that field. So in this case, it does have some visual access from the street. If you tuck the buildings behind, further back, you wouldn't see them from the street. Or maybe there's an opportunity to bring them up to the street so that it becomes an extension of kind of that Main Street experience. So this is always a question when you're thinking about future development, either as a planning project or as a development project, or reviewing, as many of you have done, development proposals, is how does it fit with its context? The developer brings you this map that is like there's no context there, right? It's just the boundaries of the site. But one of the things that I'm sure that you do, if you're on the planning board, is really look at how this site can be connected to what's around it. So do we try to connect that road in the back? Do we create a new road that comes in? How do these new buildings relate to the existing site and so on? And again, we have that sort of extension of the Main Street sort of character coming through here. So here's the lightning round, because want to move on to get you at your tables. But we wanted to sort of start the conversation by giving you some examples. And some of these are reaction to what we heard last week, which is like, which of these examples actually are on private wastewater systems, septic systems, or small package plants, and so on. So this is one in Sherwood, which is a cluster of houses around a little open space. There's 7 buildings with a cute little pocket of open space. The parking is around the back, and the rest of it is protected as open space. And it's interesting because I think this was an existing building. They tucked this around, so it really feels like it's kind of a complex that's attached to an old house rather than something being completely alien to that landscape. And they did a really interesting job with the architecture of the sort of shingle-style townhouses. But one of the things that we're going to focus on tonight is different ways of taking sort of the traditional developer's model of it's an apartment house, it's a townhouse, it's a single-family house, it's a duplex, and trying to design it so it fits into a town like West Newbury. And so one of the questions we'll ask, and we'll have you vote a little bit later on, is does this kind of architecture fit in West Newbury? So it's essentially, if you look at the plan, these are townhouses, they're shared walls. Each of these is a 2-story unit. But of course, a very interesting approach to the architecture. This is another project in Dennis, which is they protected most of this as a horse farm, and then did a cluster of units on an individual or a shared private wastewater system at one end. And this one, another question is, how do you get the roads and the parking in to serve the project? In this case, they put the road around the back, kept this open, and then connected the pedestrian space to the horse farm. And on the ground, it's very much, again, it's a townhouse community in terms of the building model, the footprint, but they designed it to look like a collection of sort of connected farmhouses. So again, a lot of interesting stuff is being done out there. Here's another one in Westport. Again, a cluster of 50 units, somewhat larger buildings. This is 10 units an acre. They protected 25 acres of land. And then the interesting thing they did is created kind of a new main street as the spine of the development with parking at each end. And then these 2 sides are kind of pedestrian only. So it's an interesting kind of a compromise of trying to get access to the parking close to the buildings, but also create a nice sort of sense of protected pedestrian space. And again, we want to talk later about, is this kind of architecture, again, sort of townhouse in plan, but sort of connected farm buildings in style, is that something that's appropriate? And one of the things they did here, which we're seeing a lot more now, is there's 2-story units and then a 1-story unit. So these can be accessible. These can be either stacked or townhouse units. But it gives it, again, that traditional variety in terms of the architecture, where some of it's low and some of it's high. Here's another one in Westport. Similar approach, townhouses, but arranged like this. Looks like a big single-family house, but it's actually 2 units in a very traditional style. Here's one in Manchester by the Sea, which is interesting. This is actually a town-sponsored project, but it combines renovation of existing apartment house, new mixed-use buildings, and then townhouses in the rear. And so these are like townhouse style. This is actually a duplex, and then there's 3 plexes and 4 plexes. But again, designed so that each person has their own private entrance, but the buildings are connected and therefore a higher density, so it's more efficient in terms of the use of space and less costly. And a very nice mixed-use building, again designed as if it was a historic building that was renovated to expand for a ground floor plan. So it's another thing we want to sort of talk about tonight is what are the models here in town that can serve, even though they might serve just single-family houses now, that might serve for multi-family houses if you carved it up a little bit differently in the interior, or which could be attached like those farmhouses. And really think about what are the opportunities to build on your traditions locally rather than something strange. This is a new mixed-use building in England. Again, sort of showing that developers can do stuff that's very traditional in terms of its proportions and its architectural design, but it's brand new. And one of the reasons this works is they've got nice, what we call retail frontage on the sidewalk, and in the back you could drive under your unit into a little garage building. So it's pretty small retail units with apartments above them and then parking for the apartments. So again, something which is really efficient in terms of use of land, but also something you could see maybe here if you wanted to have sort of more commercial space on Main Street, and so on. And so I want to finish up by showing some fairly new projects. This is one that's still in the planning stage, where they're really mixing lots of different kinds of building types and unit types together. I mean, certainly, most of us think of, oh, I'm moving to an apartment complex, and you can visualize those big shoebox buildings, or I'm moving to a condo building or a townhouse. And we all have this image from the 1970s or 80s in our minds, right? One of the interesting things that's happening now is that developers and architects, this is Union Studio from Providence, who's doing a lot of this work, they're thinking of ways, how can we take traditional building forms, mix them up within a single project to make something that's more diverse economically and socially, that meets the needs of people in different stages of their lives, but also it's more diverse visually. So you're not just having the cookie cutter units of the same townhouse, the same apartment, the same duplex over and over again, but you're mixing them up and providing a range of options. So this is another clever plan, which is what they call a manor house, but basically this is 6 apartments stacked up in 2 buildings that fit the kind of proportions of a traditional, a large house, but it looks like a house, but it's basically 3 apartments on each side with a stairwell in between that gives access to all of those apartments. This is another view of that, sort of showing how the other thing that they do very cleverly is sort of turn the wings at right angles, which again is a very traditional idea, right? The front of that federal house is parallel to the street, and then there's an L that goes at right angles in the back. Thousands of examples all over Cleveland, and certainly something that's pretty easy to do if you think about it ahead of time with a new project. This is another Union Studio project, Sea Captain's Row in Hyannis. And these again are stacked up units. This is like 3 units, these are 6 to 8 units. Again, stairwells sort of hidden, and they use that to sort of divide these up. So even though it's a rather large footprint, which is more efficient for the developer to build, it's been designed in a way which it looks like a series of smaller buildings which follow the traditional proportions of a historic home. And from the street, you have separate porches. Again, this is all one building, but they divide it up very nicely. Not just with colors, as you see so often, but in actual, the form and massing of the building. So it looks, it feels right, and it fits into that direction. I think the landscaping is, I'm a landscape architect, I think the landscaping is a little light here. They need some more trees, and maybe they'll grow up over time. But the building is certainly for, is this an affordable housing project? I can't remember how much is affordable, some proportion of it. But it's a pretty nice architecture. This is, we're sort of getting into larger scale buildings. This is an apartment in Lincoln. But it's designed, again, it's a pretty massive structure. It's like 120 feet, 120 feet by 65. So there's a central corridor and apartments on each side, which is every shoebox apartment you see at every interchange going down 495. That's basically the layout. But instead of just a straight wall shoebox, they brought the roof down over the 2nd story. They stepped back some things. And it gives it, again, proportions of, it sort of feels like single-family houses that were joined together rather than just the shoebox that landed from outer space. Another similar one, a big, fairly large apartment building in Newbury, but divided up in a way that it looks like a series of, oh yeah, it's a nice traditional townhouse. But again, it gives you that efficiency because it's basically a very large footprint. And this is the one in Devens. This is a new sort of intentionally what we call a neo-traditional design at former Fort Devens. They've been building this for many years. This is the first part, which is kind of a single-family street, on-street parking, buildings quite close to the street, and then alleys in the rear with garages. So again, interesting idea that didn't really exist 30 years ago, which is why can't we build something that looks like our towns that we used to build and the ones that we love? And the secret is really get the parking and the access to the parking in the back, bring those buildings up and have a wonderful streetscape. This is the plan. This is still being built out. This is that street of buildings. And I want to show you this building, which has just been approved. And this is the original plan for that. So we actually have some little model pieces that basically use this building footprint, which is like 60 feet by 120. Anyway, this is sort of two, again, they turned one this way and one that way and built all these dormers, so it's, you know, it really feels like a big sort of extended complex of the historic buildings sort of joined together. Unfortunately, I don't know the details, but apparently they couldn't afford to build this because that's, you know, several years on, a new developer came into the picture, a new architect, and this is the plan which is they're building right now, which is not a bad shoebox. It's pretty good as a shoebox goes. You know, the windows are lined up, it makes sense. There's some nice siding on there, a little parapet crown to give it some character. And I'm sure it'll look better in reality than it looks here. But this is the problem we're up against. This is more money to build than this per square foot. And so the balance, which hopefully we can get right in the zoning, is how do you get people to, how do you incentivize this? And what parts of this can you require so that you can avoid this, assuming it didn't sound like anybody really liked this. And unfortunately, you know, we're seeing this all over because it is a very efficient way to build housing, and that's not to be forgotten, right? If you're trying to make housing more affordable, especially housing that's not subsidized, you have to make it cheap to build, and the way you do that is with collections of rectangles stacked up floors in one larger rectangle. So I think I'm getting to the end, aren't I, Dylan? I sort of want to show, one of the things we want to talk about tonight is, you know, how can we make something that's more than just the sum of its parts, right? We can have a mix of different housing types, we can arrange them in different ways, but how can we bring them together in one project? And this, I don't know if you're out in Northampton, but this is a very interesting project on the site of the former Northampton State Hospital. It was closed like 30 or 40 years ago. And it's been developing over the last 20 years. But basically it's one neighborhood that combines all of these things, organized by a series of nice tree-lined streets with a park, playgrounds integrated, but there's single family here, there's townhouses here, there's walk-up apartments at the core, more townhouses and single family, and it's all integrated together and held together by this community plan. So it's not a plan for a bunch of separate elements, it's really separate elements that are part of this larger scheme. So the question is, you know, you could do a plan for your town center and build this yourselves, but the question is, how can we get developers to build this as they're building housing that you probably need in town over the next 50 years? And can we do what they did here, which is build on saving some existing structures, extending streets that connect to existing streets, and making something that, again, is kind of an enhancement to what's already there, rather than something that you can hide and turn back on. Oh, this is the plan. So you sort of see the single-family residential, the townhouses, and the larger sort of apartments. And it's all sort of scaled, at least it fits in Northampton, where there's a lot of those 4- and 5-story apartments already. And the character is not dependent on the architecture. It's sort of an important thing to keep in mind. So it's really good, the sense of shared street, shared open spaces, beautiful little parks, shared back sidewalks leading to little other open spaces. And the architecture is like subservient to the overall plan, which again, as a landscape architect, I think is great. Sort of let the architects do their thing, but keep them under control. But it also means that you can, this doesn't have to be a traditional building. It can be a more modern building because it's all sort of held together by the overall plan, not by the buildings themselves. And I think finally, this is an interesting one in northern Massachusetts, but it's again a sort of a mixed town center focused project. You come in, there's this beautiful green, there's townhouses on one side, there's single family and a community building at one end. And you really get the sense, even after not that many years, this is kind of a traditional place that I'd like to live. It has leafy, tree-lined streets with wide sidewalks. It's got a little mixed-use building at the entrance, this beautiful town green. And as you move back, you sort of see what that means, because it's the density that allows you to build these amenities, right? You can have the community house with the pool, you can have the beautiful green, you can have the community garden, you can have acres of open space, but only if you bring these buildings close together. Which is, again, a question we want to ask with those models is, do we want to spread the buildings out so everybody has their own open space, or do we bring the buildings together so that we can have shared open space? Again, a very, well, I guess, depending on your background, this either sounds like the greatest thing in the world, or maybe something that you're really worried about, and that's what we want to hear too. Because tonight you're here as surrogates for town meeting and whoever else has to make the decisions to adopt this. And so we want to hear, oh, that'll never work, or maybe it will. And the result is something that's like, gosh, that's pretty nice. I'd like to hang out there. So I'm going to stop there. Do we have some more slides to introduce what we're doing? We can go from here. All right.
There was a question earlier.
You already answered.
Yay! All right, does anybody else have any clarifying questions, technical questions?
It seems like a major limiting factor is access to sewer and or shared septic systems. How do we understand what is viable in that context? I mean, I recognize the zoning infrastructure, but a lot of these projects probably would or would not work based on access to sewer or septic. From the 3 sites that you're going to ask us to talk about, how should we think about what's feasible, and is there appetite at town, or are there MassWorks dollars to actually invest in a shared sewer system?
I have my opinion.
Curious what your opinion
I
is.
think probably, if the zoning allowed it and those sites were bought by a developer today, probably the most likely thing you'd see is the under 10,000 a gallon a day shared wastewater system, which would support 40 to 45 units.
And that's cost effective?
That's cost effective because they know how to build those systems, and the price of these units is probably enough to pay for the project.
Is it cost effective at 20 units? I guess that's my question. What level of density would you need in order to justify that level of expense?
That's a factor of the price of the land.
Okay.
Probably, which, like you own the Mullen property, you could build 20 units on that, I suppose.
But the shared septic system would not be cost prohibitive, or would not require that the.
No, so the recent projects that have happened in the town, the Follinsby Lane, Drake's Landing, or whatever it's called now, and Ocean Meadows, they're all shared package treatment plants. So they're all coming in under that 10,000 gallons. And Ocean Meadows, it's coming in at the max. They're all 2-bedroom units, trying to get the most number of units in there under 10,000 gallons.
That said, there's no reason you couldn't build more on those properties. We experimented a little bit, and there's a lot of room there. For a lot of buildings, especially if you do them with somewhat higher density than the single family we have now. But between that 10,000 gallons a day and the next step, you need a lot more units to support. What were you figuring?
A lot.
A lot. Which is why you see when the developers come in with an apartment, like typically under 40B, you read about in the paper, probably towns around here, it's usually like 200 or 300 units. Because they need that number of units to build those larger systems. And part of the cost is they have to be monitored like every day, right?
Yeah.
By somebody.
Right.
To make sure that they're working.
So, we can't predict the future. We can't predict what the price of land is going to be, what land's going to be available, and who's going to want to do things. I think it's more likely that you would get a smaller project, but there's some chance you could get a bigger project. A bigger project would require a wastewater treatment plant, which is something the town has previously explored. So a key question in my mind is can the town spin that to its advantage? So that in the case that you get the big projects, you're somehow partnering with them to get the wastewater treatment for your village center, so you can also get additional businesses if you want them, or the ability for current property owners to tie in on sites that are not really working out well for septic. So that's a question that we'll explore over in the village center plan. Any other questions?
I guess you have this risk no matter where you build apartments, but you talked about having a development where you put the buildings closer together. And my only fear about maybe that approach is if you have to have an emergency vehicle in, or if you have a structure fire, it's risks to all of those that are closer together, the units that are buildings that are closer together, as opposed to keeping them a little more distant. Structure fires and, fire trucks and emergency vehicles.
Sure. I guess the short answer is the public safety is always well on top of these things, and there's codes upon codes that talk about every detail to answer every worry you possibly can imagine. There's a reason that we don't have that many really bad fires among new apartment complexes around the state. It's usually in the older stuff because they have to follow those codes. But you're right, that is a concern.
So some of these designs are, relatively attractive, but if the state is requiring us to enact a zoning district with an as-of-right density, this seems to be irrelevant because a developer who manages to purchase the property is going to build works for him.
Yeah, okay, so it's required to be as of right, but your town has site plan review. And you can do site plan review for these projects. So site plan review can look at things like access and circulation, it can look at building design and so forth. So
our planning board doesn't do building design review, as I understand.
you do have some limited design standards in your zoning. I don't know how. I mean, you do. I heard from a developer that the planning board told him that he had to paint his buildings different colors, which he, at the time, he said he thought was crazy. And now he's like, I love that they did that. I go to the project and it looks so good. It's one of the best things that they did for me. So
That was under special permit.
you can have. There are many towns in Massachusetts that have site plan review for by right projects, and it is allowed under those MBTA communities.
Not to go too far down the tangent, but one of the things we've talked about at staff level is, and it's premature, I think, but with 40R, there is as of right with design standards that are statutory, that actually have some real teeth to them. Whether that's the right answer here in West Newbury is, we're not there yet. As a former planner, I'm more comfortable with 40R because there is statutory language and it is kind of proven. And again, I don't know if that's the right answer for West Newbury, but 40R zoning does meet both the as of right and the density requirement. So if there was one or more site that made sense, that is something the town could look at. It does have actual teeth, even though it's still as of right.
Well, back to the aesthetics. So if a private developer came in and wanted to build one of those shoe boxes that Devon's now has inherited, do we have on the site plan review the ability to say, no, we want the other building that originally was the design? I mean, as an example?
So the line the state is walking on this is that you can have design standards as long as they're not economically infeasible.
So see you in court?
Are you a lawyer?
No, but I've been around the world a few times.
Right. Well, also, I think I don't know what your experience is, but where the design issues really come in is where the developer's doing a 40B project, they're required to do 25% affordable, and the bottom line is really tight. Here, these aren't required to be affordable units, so they're not under that constraint in terms of cost per square foot. And presumably, you can tell me, in a town like West Newbury, beautifully designed apartment, townhouse, something like that, the developer can get their money back out of it because it's going to go for a higher rent or a higher price. But this is great to hear because we're going to go back and try to figure out, and you're going to test us about whether we can really make this solid, whether this really can work. Otherwise, we'll go in a different direction, I guess.
Sorry, just two quick questions. You might have already touched on one of these. Is there an endpoint or a cap to this within the town, or a point where they're just like, hey, you can't do this, and there's not enough land, acreage, or whatnot? And then is there a trickle effect with the infrastructure, like schools, police, fire, and how does that come to play as far as parking?
Total is 87.
The total is 87 units. I think the town can find a spot that can fit 87 units.
Will that be like the cap of it though, or are they going to come back and say, hey,
Oh, I don't know what the state legislature is going to do in the future. Can't predict that. And in terms of impacts, that's something the town can assess, but again, it's a state law, you're required to do it. And my understanding is their school enrollments are declining, or at least they've been, they've declined over the long term. They've been level for maybe 3 years. So I don't know that more school children is really a problem. Traffic from 87 units is traffic from 87 units.
water consumption and whatnot?
Yeah. And the town is doing a drinking water study, so we'll have information for that as well.
Can I know you referred to 40B and the requirement for 25% affordable units. I'm assuming that it would be within our capacity with the zoning to have some that currently are in our, I think still referred to as OSPD, we have to require 10%. We could say require 10% or 15%. Will be a very low percentage affordable housing.
So the guidelines for the law say that the town can't require more than 10% affordable housing at 80% of the area of income, which is about 90,000-ish, I think, or 95,000 for a family of 4 in West Newbury. So you can't require more than 10% affordable housing unless you go through the Chapter 40R route that Angus was talking about, in which case you can go up to 20% required affordable housing. So this isn't intended, it's intended to produce multifamily housing. It's not an affordable housing program.
Or we might choose to incorporate some portion.
Yeah, and your zoning already requires 10% affordable housing for, I think, anything over 3 units.
So, I guess the limit of that is zoning law adopted in accordance with 40R acceptable to this 40A
Yeah,
mass transit.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to break up into 4 groups, and each group is going to rotate among 4 stations for 20 minutes at each station. So
Speed dating.
it's going to be speed dating of your facilitators. The 4 stations, the first station is going to look at the village center. It's going to
are there. Each of those are relatively realistic proportions for a building of a different number of units. So this is duplexes, townhouses, walk-up stacked flats. You can see the numbers on there and apartments. And so the exercise here, kind of getting to what we're just talking about, is these are two sites that were talked about, the Dunn and Knapp sites. And the goal for this isn't necessarily to create, a perfect plan, but rather to think about through the kind of design decisions that one might include in design standards if these were to be zoned for housing. And so that we kind of have a picture of what you guys would like to see in terms of housing and configuration, where open space should be on the site, what street layout is. Are there some street layouts that are better than others, or are they all sort of fair game? Those sorts of questions that then can make sort of a blueprint for, as the next step of thinking about how one might guide development on one of these sites. Should they be zoned for housing? What should those rules be? So this is really a visioning exercise that's focused on, if you have a given number of units that a hypothetical developer might be wanting to put on the site, how would you like to see them arranged?
And the scale that the zoning would require is 15 units per acre, and this is a 19-acre site.
Right.
And so we're talking about
280.
We're talking about exactly. Yeah. So, but just to meet the threshold, if we can figure out a way to get 87 units on here, then we'd be accomplishing our goal.
Exactly. So yeah. So this is the Knapp property, and this is the Dunn property.
This is the Knapp property.
Yeah. So, or in terms of orientation, the main street north is this way, and unfortunately north is that way. I couldn't get them to line up on the table, but so if you north is more or less towards the road, and
So it's driving towards the road.
Correct.
And so the Knapp property is 19 acres, and that's 15. That's the Dunn property is 15 acres. So at 15 units an acre, this would have 208. Could have 285 units would be 15 units an acre, and 225 units would be 15 units an acre on that property. However,
Is there much wetland in this?
This is all wetlands
exactly.
here.
So about half the site is wetlands. So if you cut that down, that's more like 100, 110 units. That really would be, feasible. And then within that, there are also the septic limitations that we talked about. So I think for the purpose of this exercise, it's sort of up. I think a first question for the group is, what should our target be? So, hypothetically, one could put 225, 290 units on one of these sites with some combination of a larger wastewater treatment system, et cetera. So do we want to talk about that kind of density, or should we constrain ourselves to kind of the most realistic scenario, which would be about 90 units, and think about how a pattern might emerge from that? What do you all think? Just to tip the scales a little, I think that 90 is probably fine to talk about at this scale, and it would get a lot of the questions answered.
And with the 90, we get to use the cheaper water.
Yeah. And we meet, the MBTA requirement. I mean, if we can fit 90 in here, then we're done. Right. It feels like a non-starter to consider the town investing in a wastewater treatment facility. If that.
It's buying one piece of property.
What's that?
Buying one piece of property.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But the town's not buying this, right?
No.
Okay, so when you say town, this is a private developer.
Yeah.
But, so could it be just zoned, that one just zoned? Or do you have to have the whole section zoned? So would that incorporate all the other houses?
It's probably, I think that you could, spot zoning is not allowed, but I think that in this case,
Isn't it serving a public purpose?
yeah, I think that you probably could, but I think that those are great questions that really aren't focused here, and I think we can do this exercise without answering that. So I think that
that's kind of a big
Yeah, it is a big.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
because
it's a huge-
presumably, I mean, if it goes further, then,
Yeah.
you
Then
know,
people
this
could buy
probably
up
could
those
be.
other
Right,
properties
and
and
when,
put whatever
for
they
this
want.
purpose,
Well, it's probably
yeah,
cost
so
prohibitive. I mean,
I guess
to buy all of these at $1
so the
million
question
a pop,
being-
I mean,
I
how much, you
understand,
know?
but
the
in the
question
future,
being
somebody else could buy
whether
it, not the same
the zone
developer.
would,
Yeah.
whether you could spot zone this or not spot, but do one parcel within the zone, whether it need to be a larger district. That's the
As far as we know, you can zone one parcel.
Okay,
But for tonight's exercise, let's
That's-
just assume that
we could do that?
we're doing that, and let's figure out what's the best way to arrange buildings on the site, assuming we wanted to.
Could I ask a question of Wendy? So if one of these three sites, we could zone, whether we do spot zoning or otherwise, we could meet our threshold for MTA and also get, you know, the cheaper one, right, under 90 units. But what happens if we decide that this is the best use, but then the family decides that they don't want to sell for development, they want to conserve the land? And so we've just zoned something that functionally can never be developed. But there's a single owner, like, to what extent should we be considering the viability? I mean, the town has control over Mullen, but like, should we be mindful of the viability of the sellers and their development interests, like, or should we be zoning multiple parcels so that you don't put all the pressure onto a single owner to be able to thwart all of this?
That's my question for Dotson.
Yeah.
In assessing these and putting these at the top of the list, did you talk to the property owners? Did you have to be unbiased and just do it purely based on metrics?
I was assuming.
I don't believe we've talked to the property owners. They don't know, but I think that this is mostly was, as I understand it, you know, talking to the town and doing GIS analysis to narrow down properties that are viable.
So it could be that this person has no interest in selling at all. You just simply
They do want to sell, but they.
Oh, it
but,
has to be parcels that are.
No.
That one happens. That one happens.
Yes, but they also are not super keen on development.
Gotcha.
So they, you know.
So that's a nice coincidence.
But do we care? I mean, if we
So I
zone
think
it for that and they don't want to sell it for that?
People which buildings.
It's already
they
zoned
like
for
to
it.
start-
Who they sell it to?
Yeah.
Well, they could put a conservation
So I've-
restriction.
All right,
and-
so-
I've been given the encouragement to
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
those
yeah,
are
yeah,
great,
yeah,
and we
yeah.
have some other exercises. So,
Yeah.
so I
But
think
then it's a
that,
town's law.
so the
if you end
first
up
big
zoning
question-
I
something,
know
it can't
those
be
people
done.
have interest. I don't know how narrow.
right, so let's restrain ourselves. Think about 90 units. You can see that, you know, this has a couple units per building. That has like 20 units per building, roughly speaking. So we're aiming for about 90. So I think there's just logistically, folks that are down closer to that site, feel free to grab some buildings for there. I think we have enough that we can probably put 90 on each site. And so I think the first question I would suggest is that you've got some different types of houses over here. I would collect a set of houses and then put them in a spot that seems like you should have housing there. And this kind of related question is, what part of the site should there not be housing? So I would see if we can collect some houses and put them in the spot that maybe a subset of folks thinks is a good spot. So
How
maybe.
many units are in this case?
So this one is 3 to 5 units. This is 2 units.
Okay.
This is about eight is over there. I put some little, yeah.
Wait,
20,
so
30.
there's 20 units in that, and there's only 2 in that?
Exactly.
Are these to scale?
Yes. So this is about 24 to 32 apartments.
Oh, I see. So
This is a duplex.
the
So the
things
size,
that are on
it varies
6
by
to
the
12.
number, the square footage of the units.
So these must be studios.
These are small but typical size apartments. So 20 to 22, roughly, and I think one's 20 to 22, and one's 24 to 32. So,
Goodness.
yeah. So this is at 40 scale, so 1 inch equals 40 feet.
Wow.
And so let's get into it. So folks that are closer to that map, if you want to start thinking about where,
Just hypothetically, this is the densest housing that exists. You'd have to have some combination of that
Big Hill. This is good. Here's
just to meet the 90, and you've only got it in here. So this is.
Well, so first
I mean,
of all,
you'd have to have
sort of like
40
the
of those
idea
guys.
right.
houses back.
Or a combination.
Or a combination.
Or a combination, but this already feels very dense.
Yeah.
With,
So-
with
I'm sorry, this is,
Well, I'm not sure that property's so great.
this is
because of all
done,
the
I'm
wetlands.
done,
Right.
this is the,
Yeah, it's a green. So
The
assuming we
greenhouse.
can't develop the wetlands on this
oh
property.
boy, that's not a good place to have
Would you
houses
rather see
piled
the
up
buildings
next
up
to the
closer to
road
the
there.
street?
You know how you come around that corner and you're trying to make a left-hand turn in there and you can't see anything? Right there.
Well, and it's a hill.
It's really gonna change
It's coming up a hill no matter what.
if they're really
Yeah.
I know.
But
Yeah, just
This
right on
is,
that.
this,
Yeah.
I've walked this site twice
question
recently.
is,
This
I mean, it
historic
might
house
be
is
nice
still
to
livable,
have, like,
and then
some kind of a
what the
larger,
family would like is to
like, right at the top
maintain
of
this
here,
ag
like,
usage,
larger,
and we know somebody that would like
entry
to
house,
turn
like
this
a
into a
community
little
house where you look up and you see.
cafe and retail, like high-end retail center. This greenhouse
Big
here is
house,
actually
and then
quite nice.
Behind.
If you wanted to put seating underneath
But,
it.
but wouldn't you have to enter the property down here, like I said, because
But
on
all
this
of this is
turn, you can't
functionally-
see.
Well, wherever the driveway is now, here. Yeah.
So I guess the question there is, are any of these, is this worth saving?
But if you could look up
Think
and
that
see
it's
sort of like
worth
a larger.
adaptive reuse for this building?
It's nice up
Some of
there.
these, are there any other features on the site that are really awesome and you shouldn't have,
Big house.
you shouldn't touch?
So one interest
This is right around your neighborhood, isn't it?
because there's
You're over here.
Right here.
Yeah. So
I don't know what.
So Kevin, is it okay if we put
you
them back
get-
Well,
here?
I already knew, a long time ago, knew that gun property was among the perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
So it
I
sounds
mean,
like,
honestly,
open
as long
space
as
there
the
and
town,
some kind of open space
we pay
connection
a,
is really.
we pay that we
It sounds
get
like,
a,
keeping
retain a
that in
couple of
mind,
consultants
maybe you could
for
start thinking
drainage
through,
issues.
Right, yeah, because that's the
what
big thing
types
for
of
you is
buildings you'd
drainage.
like to see,
Yeah,
and whether
I
they
mean,
should
you
be,
know,
it sounds like maybe.
I don't,
up
because
close to the
apparently
street
when
would
they
be
built
good, whether or not you want to
Woman
on a
Center,
grid.
oh, this building here, when they built this center here, it flooded, it created real runoff issues
that they did
with
where
houses around here.
you had some shared interior space, creating a little bit of a community, whether it's
go
a
ahead.
green or
So I think I just
and
want to
then
make sure
parking behind
what I would
you know,
suggest as a
and
first
while
question,
I think this house is
to guide
not
discussion
in
if you
great
haven't gotten
shape,
to this
there
yet
is something
is,
nice about historic.
would you rather see buildings up against the street
maintaining
or
this
further back?
and
So one of the
whether
things
you
we're
make the
talking about is like
primary
maybe having sort
point
of
of access
central
here
building
or
here, you
here,
look up and you see one building.
and that way
Well,
you don't
correct me if-
And then
unsettle
you
all
have
this.
your
And there's
other
plenty of, this is
Well,
relatively
correct me if I'm
flat
wrong.
here.
I mean, you either
Some
have
couple
buildings
entities
here,
here
or
with some
you
town
have to have
access
the
there.
buildings here. You can't
That would
have
be good-
anything here
good
because it's
amenity
too
for
steep.
these
You
units.
can't, that's a terrible place to put buildings on that road.
You can build buildings into slope, assuming there's no ledge. It is
Or
more
maybe the road
costly,
goes
so
around
it's
the
not
outside and
impossible.
maintains some
But
green space in the
this is
middle. I
clearly a
don't
more
know, like
buildable
I-
area, and that's a more buildable
Right,
area.
right, yeah. I mean, because
I
just
think,
logically, I mean, I don't know, I saw like
Again, I'm
somebody,
super pro
you're
housing.
buying the main house,
this
I
is
don't know
more
what you do with
density.
the
I think
greenhouse.
the town would be comfortable
But that's
with.
actually the main house and that's
It's
the
hard for me
garage.
to
That's
fathom
right.
putting
That's like a
here, but
barn.
I don't see why
Yeah,
you
I
can't.
mean, so, I mean, conceivably,
But that
I don't know.
requires
I
that
mean,
we zone
conceivably this
multiple
could be,
parcels.
You could have something over here that kind of like is an alignment over here and then still preserve good access right
Right, to
there.
come in and, yeah.
So thinking of protecting these buildings then, or replacing
Well,
them?
no, I don't, that's a garage.
that's a garage, that's a
Yeah.
greenhouse, I mean, that,
We can't afford
that's
to
gonna
odd
be,
zone
but
anything.
This house
I mean,
is-
we,
yeah.
you know, we're
it,
gonna have
it
to
can
do
be,
something.
restored. But there is no, well, retail because of the center. I don't know how much retail it could support. Probably not a
I
lot.
have a hard time with
Normally
this
that
scale.
would be
These look
logical.
like,
So you're imagining
They
some
look-
denser,
they look like
it sounds
real
like
nice
some denser
buildings
buildings here,
to
but
me.
maybe
And I
something
think
like a
if you
cluster
look
back
at
from the
our
street here
population, I feel
of
like
lower density
senior
buildings. Is
housing,
that what you're
probably
thinking?
would walk up garden
Yeah,
style
yeah,
units.
potentially. I mean,
Let me grab some buildings.
So the face looks like a regular house, and got housing.
I just don't, I don't know that I like
Yeah,
that.
how many
that's
units?
6 to 12.
There's 20
This is a
units
good
in
scale. I
there.
like
that's a
that.
big
Close to the
building.
road?
Yeah, and they
I don't
extend
like
that way.
that.
I mean, you could put 6 of those on there. That makes for a nice density.
I like that.
Like a center.
Yeah,
that's what I said
I
about
agree with you.
retail.
Maybe we should chuck this whole 20 unit.
So these are like 3 to 5
But those
units.
also look like,
Yeah, they do.
If you had some,
Yeah.
would
what if
you
we just hypothetically put some combination
like to see,
of these
you know, how
guys
much
and
variety
some-
do you think would be good?
I think variety's
Yeah,
very
well, you were
good.
gone, we said like mixed use.
That's not bad.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
It face those towards the street.
Yeah.
Like a,
Well, I
like
don't know,
a.
don't you want it to face towards the main street, so when people drive by Main Street?
Let's
they
capture
don't
some
like
notes
what-
if, you know, while
We
we're,
need some,
feel free to, everybody grab some
road to get
sticky
in,
notes,
right?
but we can make
Or
sure.
you,
that
or
we
you're
capture some
saying
of
put them
that
all
as well.
like this?
No, not really. really.
No.
But even when you look at
Things that we can't really do easily
Yeah,
with
yeah,
those models. So let's
Yeah,
say
yeah.
that's a mixed-use area, and but with some buildings that, you know,
Just not that big.
not
Not open, not
Yeah.
housing.
That it would
Or-
still
or-
say that.
or maybe there could be some, couple of
Maybe
that.
take some of
couple
those
of
buildings.
apartments.
Yeah.
Something on that scale.
Like the pizza building.
Right, right. That would be, I think, a nice thing.
Something like that.
So I would continue that discussion and think a little bit about if you want variety up here. So this is like 3 to 5 units. You know, what kinds of buildings?
I mean, that could be 50.
How much
You
variety?
said
Not an
these are 3 to 5,
insubstantial
you said-
Yeah, uh-huh.
right?
And then
These
so
are 6
those
to 12. And
those buildings there are like apartment buildings with like 20
Yeah,
plus
those are
units.
too big.
Those are 2 units.
What do people
So
vote?
maybe
Think about having
maybe
some
6 is
safety
more accurate there, but
or
even
do
at
we
6,
really
it's
lose our
probably still
numbers?
1 or 2 beds.
Well, for multifamily.
How many?
6 to 12. Feel free to
These
take
are-
notes
6 to 12.
if you'd like, or if you can.
Those are
But
6 to
you know,
12?
the goal here is if we can think through a configuration in this area, kind of key patterns, whether you like thinking of
Yeah,
a
a couple
grid
of
or
those somewhere.
right?
Yeah.
And any other of those kind of key ideas that come out of the discussion, make sure we want to mix them up, and you want to keep them.
So how does that work out? Mix up the sizes. When we hit our magic numbers,
Like, let's say here and here are our magic numbers. I mean, what would we do with that land?
Yeah, because you can use this space too, I'm taking.
Yeah, so think about some places that you could be open space.
So you
you
don't,
could have
do you
some
like
open
it
space.
clustered over there and don't want to use this?
Some kind of septic. Yep, this is all part of it. Thinking about what should be protected and
Oh, yeah, I would say use
and open
some
space.
of
Run
it,
into your
right?
neighbors there, right? And otherwise you don't run into.
So that's what you're talking about right here?
I think it would be nice if you can maintain some commercial.
No, that doesn't preclude it.
You know? Because it comes from here.
Keep the character of nature where you see
I
that.
think. Yes, this is something
Are you imagining kind of a central green in this area?
Trust me, I've looked at Google Maps for a lot on this. What is that?
I found some of those photos. Someone's
But they seem to have those, is
So
this a
these
real
are all,
map? Like
you know,
those are like vehicles
Very
parked back
similar,
there?
like
Yeah.
densities, and you could
That's a
change
house.
the
Now, I know where
architecture
this-
a little bit, but
I know where that house.
What
how
is
much
that?
uniformity
Well, that's a house down
Comfortable
Maple
versus
Street.
the
There's a driveway. right by the rectory.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you drive by the rectory. There's a driveway right next to it. Well, this is the driveway that goes up to this house.
Wow.
That's a nice house.
It sure looks like it.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get back. So
Anyways.
how many houses,
Yeah.
how many units do we need to have?
Well,
Supposed to have
I think for this exercise,
and
right.
with 5
I think
acre
for this
density, I mean, we got
exercise,
plenty of land.
How many
we've given
houses
you
are
a
in
kit of
these?
parts that
I think those are 6
roughly realistic. I think it's really
12, I
important to,
think. Oh,
to
no,
focus on what would create a really great spot. You know, a good community.
I know, see, these don't,
They need
To have the
numbers.
character that you
they really
like,
do.
and we can
They
you know,
should have had a number.
try to get as close to that
Written
as
under
we can
for us.
within the tools that are.
I say, you say by tools.
This group took all the good ones.
Yeah. What should the design say? If there's
So you're
standards,
saying
what
this
it
is.
should be standards.
You think we
You
did
took
this?
all the good shapes, is all I'm saying.
Now, are these are 6 to 12 right here?
Yes.
Hey, do you remember? Are these 60?
And these are
Those claim to be 6 to 12 over there, although that looks very small. The ones in Wendy's hand, they said those are 6 to, although that looks, again, too small. Maybe these are 6
Yeah, I
to
think the
12.
scale is awful,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too.
to say the least.
Okay, 6 to 12, so, okay, so how many, 6 to 12, you gotta pick a number, 8, what?
Well, I guess the question I have with 6 to 12, is that rental? Or is that?
Well, no, I think that's to be determined by the
Right.
developer.
Well, yeah, I mean, they definitely have some apartments there. That's all I was wondering.
It's just like one of the many
Oh,
rivers,
Wendy, that looks
way to the
good.
river.
Yeah.
It just kind of goes back and has houses on it. It's nice.
You gotta keep the field, Wendy.
What is that, that's maps?
She's in
But
that
the other
big
thing too is
circular
when you rip all of this
design.
down,
Yeah, right.
then this, this all goes down. I think that this, if you maintain this,
Maybe
that's
we
enough for a
should
commercial
use
unit.
some, you know,
But
kind
all
of
of these
keep this
greenhouses
mixed
have
line, maybe get
no,
more of these smaller
no
houses.
market value.
these guys?
Even if you wanted to have a greenhouse, three friends walk it, it'd be cheaper to rip it down and put in a greenhouse.
Well, see, we've got some,
So I
there's
think
3
you
of
assume,
them.
yeah,
Here and
exactly. I think
over
you
here,
assume that
and
that's
then,
back
like
to
on
zero,
the edges,
right?
the smaller houses and the bigger one, or there could be opposite.
Well, I mean,
How many is that?
if we had this all zone multifamily, we would be able to hold, I mean, there's 15 acres, so they're looking at 250 units,
At least average 5.
which we only need 87.
Well, I wish I knew how many units we had
Are you
sitting here right
imagining using
now.
that existing
Exactly.
curb cut or having
So-
everything is separate?
So I think these are what, 3 to,
And you're imagining like a curved road?
I can't do 6 to 12, that's.
That's what it says.
Stay and
I
still
know.
become mixed use.
Well, yeah, well, those are actually liver. I know.
So we don't have any really little houses here.
How many units do you estimate that is?
It's in the it's in the middle, so it's kind of like 8. Think about it.
So if these are like
10, if these are 6 to 12, we'll just say 10, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Okay, that gets us 50, so we only need 40 more, and if these big guys are,
Well, I mean, this, I don't want to put more up here next to me, but.
uphill.
I think you're probably gonna
noise, Kevin.
Well, yeah, I know, well, yeah, that's true. It's not that bad.
We'll put
I mean,
the playground right back here.
Well, yeah, that you'll get me, yeah. It's not that, I mean, because we got a lot of buffer here, we really do. I thought it out.
Oh, you're putting a road into it, that's extra
I thought it
credit.
out.
So how did you
Peter,
call
these
number 2?
the 6, these are the 8.
Oh.
Those are 8 units.
Well, you know, the guy right now with the hat over there.
Yeah, those are
Comes over and
8.
tries to-
These are 20. These
Starts
are,
asking questions, it's just like, why?
that's like more of a shoebox with a peaked roof, that's like 24, 32 units.
So, he kept talking, I decided to leave.
Oh, okay, so you just found 2.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah,
Well,
where do you actually put the septic?
2 is
this
in my heart.
site?
No.
It's actually probably about that
It's
size.
like, if I'm gonna go somewhere, I'm gonna go over here. So, no, I mean, I could see this as a,
Can you really do that? And then,
a larger Drake
Sure, it's
landing.
done all the time.
You know,
This
where-
wouldn't really be there then, right?
I don't think so. I mean,
That's a nice thing. You're not getting a lot of density.
yeah, I mean, something,
Could you replace all those buildings?
Yeah, I think something that fronts it would be very attractive.
I think they're trying to get just one parcel that
Yeah.
gets all of it.
we're up against.
Or something actually, you
Part
know,
of it is to test what fits, right?
Might be a little on the hill.
How would you, we
side.
talked about commercial mixed use down here, would that
Down
be
here,
a
you
place
mean?
that
No, right here.
people, you
So,
know,
but even like you said, something here in your
a
road.
larger, if you were to have a
Like
larger
this.
building?
Yeah, there's plenty of room that way,
There's plenty.
actually. Yeah.
I mean, hell, I don't want to get too carried away, but you could literally put something small right there.
That's nice because you look at the church and everything. It's actually,
I mean,
I like the mixed use.
I mean, you'd want, that's too big of a footprint. But you know what I'm saying.
Where
it'd be hard to, you have a house there, you need people or whatever.
place, you have 2 of those, you have 10
Yeah, so you're coming up here. And then do we want to leave any open space?
I think you have all this back here.
Yeah.
and it's an amenity.
Yeah, well, this is
I
like
can
all
see
this.
people walking
Yeah,
down
so we have a lot-
to
yeah, so
you know,
like-
get a coffee.
It's really nice having some
Or you put a
trail
public
area.
playground there
Right.
and people are
that's
coming,
not
getting coffee,
buildable, so
having
that'll
kids
stay.
play.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
well, and
I
this
think
is
a
very
building of that
steep
scale
too.
might be a,
So,
Yeah.
my personal opinion is
so nothing would be in there, so you gotta either be up here or down here.
well, I mean, back to this road, you could start building stuff around here.
Did we end up with enough?
Thank you so much for your input. I'm gonna take a picture.
So they even.
It's probably
they
more
even do
palatable
the
to the
septic
town.
system here.
We figured that out.
All right. So if someone
So
wanted
good to see you
just,
guys. I
just
have
lay
to
out
make
the
enough
main
buildings
ideas. Okay, so it's like a
You guys are
grid
gonna move over here.
concept, and we've
We're,
We're moving to this corner here.
it's kind of our, well, I don't know, that's one of our concepts.
so you've got some buildings close to the street.
You can put them on both sides here.
Oh, yeah.
Why they even need a septic?
Hey, Brian. Well, conceivably, you could just develop this side and keep my side clean.
But it's kind of a central, is this like a central green area?
Exactly.
Green and then, you know, like.
Perfect.
We also have a green, has one central.
So Brian, what's the one drawback of done property?
Oh, I know, it's fun.
Which is,
All right. So I'm just going to take a
You know whose
picture of
land
this
that
before
is?
the next group shows up. But thank you
That
so
is
much
Sunday.
for your.
Create a pretty good project.
well,
Rick.
by the way,
Brian,
the land next to it,
Is that you?
yeah, that's me.
Hey, you're taking pictures?
So he'll be my,
Can you shoot the rest of your people over to the
he'll be my stopgap.
Anyone that was here from group
I don't
two?
think you have to worry.
Anyone who
The
was here
hill
from the
isn't gonna
last
go
round in
away.
group two?
No, I
could you
know.
go over
I'm
to
not.
Peter?
I'm honestly not. Although I will say, the planning board, we got to hire you guys a real good consultant for drainage.
Brian, Kevin.
That's your next station over there.
Number 2?
Yeah, you have to go.
You know, we're trying to get a road.
You're not leaving?
Where are we?
Brian likes the spot.
You know, where,
Well, no, I
because
just-
the road that it's hard enough to get in here now.
Right, is this Church Street right here?
Right.
Supposed to go to Route 2.
And there's a cross right
And
here.
there's a Girl Scouts here.
Oh.
Scout Scouts who did better.
You're a road.
Hey, people.
All right, so welcome. We're going to get started. You can see out here the products of the last round. This is your round, so we're going to start fresh. I've taken pictures of these, so don't worry about disturbing them. And
Where are we?
So this is the Dunn property. This is Main Street, so north is roughly this way. That's the Knapp property, north, and Main Street's over there. So on that one, north is kind of in that direction. Yep. The Dunn has 15 acres, and that's 19 acres. So if you were to...
I was led to understand that roughly a third of this is wetland and is not useful.
Right, so if you're looking at this map...
Probably close to half of it.
Exactly, about half. Right, so this is the Knapp property. It's about 19 acres. You can see the blue, it's a faint line, but there's a blue line, which are the state mapped wetlands. But basically this half of the site is wetlands.
This is a skatable pond right here.
So if you imagine, 19 total, it's really about half that. At 15 units an acre, this would be about 225. That would be 285. But half of it's wetlands, so it would be about half that at 160 or so, or 140. And however, both of those numbers, as you may recall from the intro presentation, are a lot higher than the goal of 87 units in the town. So either of these sites are large enough that they could support that 87 units, and of course there are limitations from septic systems that would so really the kind of most realistic number of units that would be possible on these sites without a large wastewater treatment component to the project would be like more of the 40 to 90 units. So in this exercise, the goal here is to come up with a vision for how one might arrange, let's say 40 to 90 units, some amount of units that if a developer were to develop the site and they're bringing in their program of 40 to 90 units, how would you like to see those units arranged? And the purpose of that is to create a vision that then could create kind of a blueprint for design standards that could potentially guide development towards that. So the point here is kind of taking a big step back and saying, what would make this a successful, attractive place? And so we've got some different buildings of different densities. So these are apartments, so they're little apartments, probably like 20 to 30 units a building range for these larger buildings. These buildings are about 8 units an acre, 8 units total in the building, and I think these are 10. So buildings about this size are in that 8 to 10 unit range, and they're apartments, but they're maybe a little larger than the sort of shoebox apartments in those. And then these are 3 to 5 units an acre, and these are 2 units duplexes. These are all multifamily. So what we're...
Sorry, I'm confused. You're saying this is 2 units?
Yes.
But show me one that's 10.
So they're similar scale, but the number of square feet per unit varies. So the duplex is a larger home.
So if you're talking about those being 20, are we talking about 1-bedroom apartments, 2-bedroom apartments?
Yes, smaller, like 1, 2 bedroom.
But we need family apartments.
Right. So there's
Sorry, I'm talking too much, but
no. So the purpose here is, so given a program of from a couple units a building to lots of units a building, how would you like to organize, or what do you think would fit and wouldn't fit, and how you would like to organize them? So the goal here is to get too in the weeds on how to design the building, as much as to think about what spaces you would like to shape on the site with the buildings, and kind of broadly speaking, the variety of buildings you'd think would be acceptable for each site.
we did.
Well, speaking for myself, I think in general terms, I'd like to see a mix on each site, as opposed to roll me another one just like the other one. know, so personally, I think some number of apartments would be useful in town. It would serve a demographic that would like to live in this town. Some people who are younger in particular who would love to come back to their town, but they can't because there's nothing at all to serve their need. Nothing that's affordable.
So let's get into it. You know, there are these two sites. The way the last group worked, they kind of split into which site they were most interested in, and I bounced back and forth. We could do that, or we could start at one site and go to the other one. It's up to you all. If you have one site you'd like to gravitate to, I'm happy to do two at once.
We're a pretty cooperative group. We work together. I think so. We spent some time on this because we were looking at the town center before.
Okay.
So should we dive into this one?
How many, like, with what's showing right there, how many units is that?
So I think that we figured it was about 80 to 90. So they were aiming, so the goal being about 87 units. So and so these were the about 8 units. So 16, 32. It's like 60. They're probably in the 60 to 75 range. And then they were showing. Both groups thought it was interesting to show a mixed-use building of some size, and there was some disagreement about how big of a mixed-use building in both groups.
By mixed use,
commercial, commercial on the first
residential.
floor and
Yep.
residential above.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
And see, we're talking over there. I threw out the idea of it'd be great to have either one. I threw out the idea of it would be cool to have a cafe of some kind, and a mixed-use building would be kind of neat to have, I think.
So instead
Where it could make it a sort of a magnet.
Instead of focusing on 87 units, though, just be poking with this, I don't think it's a realistic expectation that the soils on 10 acres in West Newbury are going to give you 87 units for the site. So,
yeah, I think that for this exercise, I would encourage you to. I don't think it's super important whether it's 40 or 90 for this exercise, and I think that range is realistic enough to start talking about what components you'd like to see and how to organize them on the site. So I think a similar range seems reasonable to me. I think a first way to start thinking about it maybe is to think about what things should not be developed. So, you have wetlands that basically can't. So if you think about this half of the site primarily as something that can be developed, are there some buildings that should be protected? Are there particular spaces or an amount of space that should be left as open space? Are there important potential trail connections?
Well, so
is this protected back here, down at the end of this little street, remember?
I don't know.
That goes down to like
I don't know, but back here, it is protected. This is I think this is what was Mark Gowan property, and this is the end of it. So this wetland feeds into the between Tewksbury and Crane Neck. The Cosentino's house is out here, and so that's like from a natural, from a habitat standpoint, that's a really important area. There's a lot of stuff in it.
And this comes up into here. So, I guess I would say just the streetscape along here, to my mind, would lend itself to the less intense, maybe duplex-ish type units. I think it's, this is wet because I know it's across the street. You can tell.
The slope, so probably, it could be a wet slope, but it is a slope.
I don't know if here we want to avoid this street coming up and then the other street coming up there, so I don't know where the entrance is, but it seems like continuing this kind of, bigger stuff along the front and then gradually working into maybe some 6 to 12 unit type things in the back.
This is a nice view from the street.
It is a nice view.
Should any of these buildings be kept? So, no?
Well, this is all greenhouses, that's happening. And this is a house that's,
Yeah, and the greenhouses are in some disrepair.
yeah, all the buildings on the side, I would say, are in.
we can assume
modest to poor condition.
that those, protecting those isn't super important anyway.
No.
The trees are.
The trees are beautiful.
Okay.
Yes, they are. There are some beautiful trees. I mean, maybe what that beautiful view is the entrance, because you can still look down an entrance way.
Yeah. Now, for entrances, kind of typical site engineering approach is to try to line up your entrances with a road or else offset it so that you don't end up with weird. Yeah.
I think it's tricky getting out of there where we park now because of this curve. I think it's a little more favorable that way.
You can only take a right out of this road now.
Yeah. Looks like there's a crosswalk here, and for folks, pedestrians that are, or is that something? Looks like it. Yeah, but it sounds like, so folks feel like maybe an entrance up on this side makes more sense, or one down here, or two entrances?
Are we required to have 2 ways in and out for safety?
Well, we're currently limited by 500 feet for dead end, right? Isn't it 500 in the subdivision regs? And or Brian?
750, 800.
But we,
It's
waive
800?
We
Okay.
usually waive it.
Okay. But it used to be 500.
I know, did we finally just change it because we were always waiving?
Inflation.
So, let's say that if you had to have 2 entrances, where would they be? Keep this one and then one here. Does that seem fair? Too many, or
really
should we
does.
do so one entrance?
Because I mean, there's a reasonable amount. There should be less traffic there, no?
Yep.
I know,
But
the
this entrance
sightlines are terrible.
is yeah.
So then
There's a lot of traffic that comes
Yeah.
up and down.
Right.
so fair. So one.
This sight line is okay. I mean,
It's a better sightline.
yeah.
Okay, so let's say one entrance and it's here. People feel good about that?
Not 100%.
Okay.
But beautiful winding
have-
road.
Right.
that
Well,
got looked at.
Yeah. Well, we can.
So Doug, when you say
Magnolia trees, kind of.
when you say not 100% wide,
I just think it's a nice view.
yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
But entrances can be nice streets too.
Then you got blacktop on the other side.
Yeah, and you're allowed to disagree. So I'm going to put nice view and one entrance, and we'll just remember that there's some. It's not a. There's pros and cons.
The property in Groveland that you drive.
Okay, so another good question is, I had heard the idea of bringing some buildings up to the street, but maybe sounded like buildings that were in scale with the other buildings along the street. Is that what you were saying?
I think so.
Okay.
The streetscape, such as it exists here, is broken up by this nursery, and we all love that, but it's not a nursery. It seems like the streetscape ought to be kind of recreated. You can't do it across because this is that a couple of years ago.
Would the house go with this if this were the developed piece?
Yeah, so this would all be one. I think for the purpose of this exercise, imagine this is one development.
Do you mean would the house be retained or?
Yeah.
No, what I mean is, if this property were required by the developer, would that house be included in the property? So that, for instance, the developer could extend that house or do something with it
Yeah, they could.
to preserve the structure,
Yeah, if it were in good shape.
but get more, so to speak, more mileage out of it.
Yeah. So I think in any case here, when we're talking about land that's currently privately owned, all we can do is speculate on how. Now, this is each of these has their unique situations right now, but it's hard to say what the current landowner or family would choose to do.
Yeah.
So we can zone, but we can't. Again, it's a market and personal preference driven thing by owners, current owners of the land.
Can't force it at this point.
Well, what I'm hearing so far, though, is potentially a preference, though. So you're not saying this, which would be, pretty different. So apartments along the street. Right. So it seems like there's a preference for duplex.
That's
How
too
about?
much of a nice streetscape.
Right. So, this is like a duplex. These would be smaller apartments, but in a building that has a similar mass against the street. Does that variety strike you as being acceptable, or should it just be, aimed for duplexes right along the street?
Except for our trees in our entrance.
Right.
I guess what I'm thinking is we're already accustomed to seeing structures here. So maybe you put similar,
That's where your mixed use goes.
or you put things that look like a greenhouse kind of bulk.
How about apartments? If you were to have apartments in the project, would you put here or have them further back?
Yes, I think a lot of families would want to have more open space and be further from the busy road.
That's true.
I think if there are apartments that, from sort of a visual impact, sort of maintaining the integrity that we currently have along Main Street, it'd be better for them to be farther back so that they don't dominate Main Street.
But then there's more traffic driving along the roads into the development.
So
people who are in front have more people passing by it. There's
So if you
more
had
density of population.
a road coming back here,
So maybe along what you were saying, Carol, if the traffic, if the main parking areas were biased towards the front, then so that to limit how far the traffic has to drive in.
No, I don't know. I mean, people want to be able to unload their groceries and not hike up the.
Right.
Yeah. So do we want to have a sort of a skewer scheme where the driveway is a skewer and the buildings are on either side, or do we want a circular thing with the buildings around it?
more of a grid.
If you kept, you're gonna need a septic. This, you keep it open space. If you keep this as open for septic, you keep the sight line here. You're tucking all of this stuff in the rear over here.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about that too.
Yeah, I actually don't know.
Yeah, well, actually, I can
Is that on?
find that while we're talking.
That's not sure.
So, the previous
Maybe
group,
go along that property.
the previous group had kind of gotten to a sort of a lollipop with a septic in the center, which is I think a really viable and sort of many places. I think just to explore whether other options might be interesting to folks. You could also there's something that is more like a street grid. You could have more of a green, even though the site, like the benefits of going with radial streets is you could follow the contours and there's minimizes grading and things of that nature. But there's some opportunity, you could make something that was like more of like a little center, and you could line things up and then put the septic, there or at the top of the hill.
Given where we all know the water table has got to be,
Yeah.
the septic in the middle would turn out to be Mount Green, it would be huge. If we could find an edge for it where it sort of fades into the contours.
So, these are kind of tucked around the corner. This is a street or trees here, so you wouldn't see this.
So the high point is right here.
Yes.
And is that a logical place to have septic on the high point? I mean, there's no guarantee anything about soils,
Right.
but is it more likely that
It is level already.
Well, you don't know. You're going to have to pump up to everything up to it if it's so high.
Right.
But I think putting aside the logistics of where the septic field is feasible for now, would you like to have this arrangement where you see right now, if you were entering the site the way it's arranged now, you'd have a view kind of to an area that, you could put the septic over here, but if you put it over here, you'd have, a field, and then a portion of that could be developed as the septic field, or vice versa, and then you'd be going to a pretty dense set of larger buildings in a grid versus that previous idea of,
I like tucked
First of what you were just saying, the first one. Yeah, no, me too. I sort of think, this is a bunch of people's backyards. Maybe putting the septic over there and landscaping it appropriately.
You still see, as you come by, is a
Still
viewscape.
greenery and not
is-
built.
yes.
Yeah.
But I don't know what this is. Did you figure this one out yet? Next to Naps.
It's like it's, there's a house here, so.
It's researching.
Yeah,
well, we can look at, I mean, we can see who the owners are and what the parcels are, but these are the parcels around it. You know, so, you know, there is a house on that parcel and there's a house on that parcel.
Yeah,
Looks
that's
like
this one.
Looks like it slopes off this way gradually anyway, and therefore that
same
wet
thing.
quality is probably going to
Right,
remain.
that's right.
These are wetlands here.
That's right.
Yeah, it has that same drop down to the wet.
So returning to the density, so you know these are like 20 to 30 units. So that would be nice, you know, 20. If you, that's probably 60 units there. So the question there is, you know, if your goal is 90 units, you know, you could put them all in one spot in the back, or you could, you know, protect.
And I think we know you're not going to get 90 units
I
on that
just
site.
don't think it's that
Sure.
high.
I understand.
Right.
You say, well, we should. It's not going to be physically possible.
Right. Understood.
With the septic.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
I guess as a principle, what we're saying is less dense, somewhat more dense, most dense.
and most dense both in terms of buildings and also putting them together, so then you have more part of the site that you can protect or use for septic. Is that what you're
Well, by the
saying?
time you, well, I don't like those huge buildings either, but by the time you get septic.
Yeah.
Or what about, you know, you have one of the larger buildings of some kind, and then, you know, something that is more in the 6 to, or still larger, but, you know, have something.
I think the people living in it looks more like, yeah, the sort of connected things that we looked at. Like a house and a barn.
And then nothing by the street?
No, I would still do stuff by the street because it's perfectly nice level street frontage.
No, I agree.
And it feels like kind of a loose tooth, or missing tooth if you don't do something by the street. I think it's
Well, maybe that's where there'd be a mixed-use building.
That's closer to the street.
Right.
We're already used to seeing this as commercial
right,
space.
it's already commercial now,
Right,
so
right.
a little something,
Right,
whatever it
yeah,
may be
yeah.
for the coffee shop.
And it serves the development itself, and it serves the residents.
The second coffee shop.
And that would also argue too for that being the principal access for it.
Right.
Right, you go in there, but not to
As
penetrate
as
the whole
Doug
site.
points
just
out,
to
this is
go
right
somewhere.
turn only. So having a turn out of there may not be as difficult. It is a little tricky with the circular drive, but it's maybe because you're coming at an angle. If you're coming down perpendicularly, you might get a better sight view in both
You
directions.
know, there's an option too, if you wanted to keep this as a view, would be to put the entrance here and just have more of a grid here and go, you know, out. So you have kind of a little center, and then you have a turn, and then this meanders out to the back.
The issue here in terms of getting too dense would be the
Actually
parking.
used, I don't remember.
Everyone's
Is this,
coming in that one
it is
door.
primary, Harrison, I was trying to remember the name. So it is actually the three, shown here, three drives on
I think
it.
it's
It's not a-
confusing us to track it if they're.
And as she
if all
said,
the
you can
traffic
only
for this
turn
whole thing
that
was to
way,
come in by
And annoying for
and annoying
whoever's
for
in
the
that.
people who live
Yeah, I
there.
mean, this is true
Building
whenever we
right
would
there.
do anything. Once we're just coming off one entrance, putting a lot more
Yeah.
houses in there.
I think this has some, you know, pretty clear principles in it. People feel good about it. We could talk about the next site if you want, or we could. Does this feel like we've got some consensus about this being maybe pretty good?
Could you estimate what these represent
Yeah.
wise?
This is probably 24, and then this is, I think I said 8. So 20, 44, 8, whatever. 52, and then 8, 2, 12. So,
It's like almost close to 70 to 80 units.
yep. So I think a good way to think about this exercise is, again, we're not developing the site, but in terms of standards. So let's say if 90 is kind of like the logical, maybe maximum that's you could consider as being possible, then this is how you might organize it, and it might be a pleasing,
Right.
one could organize it this way. And it would be good. So,
How about the other one and impart all the wisdom we have with this?
Well, it's just the amount of cars coming out of those. I often wondered where this house was.
so,
The driveway's off of Maple Street.
so same questions over here.
Yeah,
Maybe
Yeah, I don't recognize that structure at all.
right, because that's Maple.
This is done, yeah.
So maybe
No, there was some talk about building here, but concern about, that's a hill.
Oh, I thought we were thinking about that here, where the greenhouse is.
so those are
So it's really steep when you're sitting in the center section. So I think the access has to be either where it is, right? Or this way.
oh, look at all these vehicles here.
And there's Farm Road, so it's proven that you can get it.
So, there's always, whether or not ledge would allow it, you can build into slopes, and there's some opportunity from that sometimes. So it's not out of the question, but it certainly is more expensive. So, the previous group said, okay, well, this is level and pretty developable, so we should really think about the site as this being protected, open space, this being one sort of node, and this being another node. Does that seem like...
This is also available. Yeah. Just because it's got something on it now. So in some ways, again, given that there's something there now, that could be a place where something could be, right? That wouldn't interfere with this, protecting this open space. This has been leveled, it looks like. And there's another level in the area, right?
What's the possibility of building some structures on grade? Because where this grades off, you could get 3 stories on one side, two stories on one side, 3 on the other.
Right.
Or you could get parking underneath or something like that.
Yeah, so
I'm sensitive to having how much hot top this is going to represent. I like the idea of parking within the structure, so it minimizes the amount of paved space.
So to that end, these are 1 foot contours, so like if you were over
The closer
here,
they are, the steeper it is.
yeah, so like if this were the main road, and you could potentially, I could
It was a
imagine
pretty gentle grade.
retaining the wall with it, yeah.
Underneath here or around this way, even, right? Well, I don't know.
Yeah, so that's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, you want about 6
So-
to get your story under.
So you could do that there. There's similar opportunities. If you had something up here, you could have parking potentially coming in from this side.
From the perspective of the people who are living there too, being located back here is going to be very scenic. It's going to be very private, and very quiet, yeah. I mean, from the developer's standpoint, that's a real sales funnel.
So do you think that? So you think that what part of this should be? Is there anything that would
Well, I think
should be protected?
You've got 2 clusters that you can use, and still have a lot of open space.
Okay.
Pardon?
Maybe leave it sort of open at the bottom.
Yeah.
Just so you make a beautiful entrance, but this all happens very far.
So with an apartment building, you could put parking underneath. Many of these, you could put parking underneath. Would you? Same question over there. If you had a higher density building as part of this program, would you like to see it further away or closer to the street?
I would like to not see a higher density building.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So let's say there's no.
Could I put some medium and some medium?
All right, folks, we're going to switch.
1, 2, 3, 4.
On to the next.
Just getting started.
I mean,
So-
would you see any of these from the street?
No.
Not here.
No, I don't think you are, because of that hill. The hill's going to block the view. My eyes are always on the road anyway.
Yeah, I've been up. I've been up there, but
But if you're passing it,
no, you can't see it. You can't physically see it from the street.
Well, thank you so much. I think we had a really great discussion there, and I think we got some ideas here. So it was
Great,
it was awesome.
thanks.
Yep.
Underground parking of the buildings.
We lost you.
Where's one go to now?
Yeah.
step?
To Peter.
I think we lost most of our rules.
Is this number 3 here? 3s are here?
This should be 4.
This is 2.
No, 2.
Oh, we
So
go
you're
over
going
here.
over to 2 and, so you're doing both at once?
The last one I did both at once. This one we did one at a time. So I'm just asking what they want to do.
The original idea was to sort of flop, just do one for each group. But this is fine.
If anyone hasn't done modeling and would like to do that,
Is this for 4?
I don't know.
I think we should
but
be-
if you would like to do modeling, you're welcome to join me. I'll see other folks here.
We did modeling on Mullins.
Okay, so this is Knapp and Dunn.
Okay.
I guess. Hello. So,
Knapp and Dunn. You said
this is Dunn and this
Dunn
is Knapp.
and Knapp.
Yeah. And so you can see what the last group did. The first round, folks kind of did 2 plans simultaneously. The last group we spent a lot of time here and then moved over there at the end. I guess the first question is there one site that you're more interested in? Happy to do. We could think about either one, or both. But with a smaller group, we probably should just pick one.
So you're gonna stay with your?
So the Dunn property is close to the town center.
Right, this one's close.
This one's a little further out, but maybe a little easier. I don't know if it's easier to develop.
So for orientation, this is Main Street. North is roughly this way in this plan, and roughly this way in this plan. Main Street again. So Dunn and Knapp. Dunn has about 15 acres. This has 19 acres, but about half of that's wetland.
So that's like 10 acres
Yeah.
buildable?
Right. Yep. And so I think the big takeaway there is with those number of acres, if you multiplied by 15, it'd be like 225 units there, 285 units here. Realistically, that isn't likely to be developable on either site because of septic constraints, and the goal overall is something like 87 units. So, the previous groups, it was an exercise in thinking of like 40 to 90 units of saying like a developer was coming to us and saying we want to put 40 to 90 units on this site, and then think about what principles we think would be important for guiding the location of those units.
I guess
So-
I'm similar to these, just have the open space in the middle.
Right. So they're 2 different sites. I think with the smaller group, if you don't mind, I think we should pick one and just focus there. So this is the Dunn property, and this is the Knapp property. Is there a
Does
preference?
this one have?
We focus on Dunn.
Yeah. Does this one have any septic constraints? Like you were talking about with the
They
Knapp?
probably both have some kind of constraints, but I believe that one's
Worse.
Worse because it's got wet load. Most likely worse, but
Yeah.
I think this seemed like the less constrained site between the 2.
Now you can't drive a septic through wetlands, correct?
Correct.
Because somebody, when we were first looking at that property, someone told us you could, and I was like, no. So you can't drive septic through wetlands.
Yeah.
No.
And
You put
I
a
would
pipe
encourage, I think that
You
for
put
this
the pipe?
exercise, I would
Or
love.
maybe that's what they were talking about.
I
Yeah,
mean, there's plenty of pipes that go through wetlands.
So
For-
could you?
For this exercise, I'd really like to kind of set septic aside at the
Okay.
moment and think about, so we've got some buildings of different densities, and think about how you would like to see those arranged. If you were to visit this site and someone had developed it, what would you find pleasing, to live in? What would you find pleasing to drive past? What kind of configuration should we think about?
I don't want that one.
How much
Yeah.
of this?
Are there 2
big
buildings
one?
already on
The
this
three,
site?
I don't want the
Yes.
3-story.
So these are maybe as
I
a
don't
starting
like those
point
either. I don't
on
like
this
those.
site. Again, this north is this way, and so
about
there
the
are
apartments?
these are some
I
existing
don't like
buildings
those
on the site.
I like
think
the
it's like a
smaller
greenhouse, a
Yeah,
house,
I
and
don't know what this is.
garage or something on this side. And then there's greenhouses back here, and then some open fields, and this is a steep driveway. So these are each 1 foot
Those are
contours.
townhouses, the one you just mentioned is townhouse.
My question is, how much is
3 to 5
visible from the road, even?
I would guess not much because
Right.
you have a very steep slope. There's
So we
forest
don't have
here.
to worry about views from the, that shouldn't really be much of a consideration. Once you're inside, then you care what it looks like, right?
Yeah, so a lot of the previous groups have kind of thought about the site for that reason is there's this small area of flat ground that is on the street, and that's kind of what you'd see. And then you have some areas that you wouldn't see from the street, but potentially have some really great views.
Right, that would be nice.
So I think a good starting point, is there anything here that should be kept? You know, are there some areas or some
I have a
portion
question. What
of
are
the site?
these two
Those
things?
greenhouses?
Greenhouses.
Those are going?
Yes.
Yeah.
I like-
They'll be gone?
Seen it, they're gone? Okay. All right.
Maybe it'd be great places for houses.
Mm-hmm.
So this doesn't seem to have a.
That's the other green, that the other greenhouse in the
It's
front?
not, doesn't seem
That's
to
going too.
It's gone too, right?
So you can imagine that. What do you think about this existing? I don't know the quality of the house, but
Looking at facing, even whether it's repurposed or.
That's a good idea.
You'd want a house, I think, to keep that.
I guess I like, the one concept I like is some place that looks like a garden or an open area.
A shared
Either.
open common garden?
A common area
Yeah.
of some format.
would you like
So-
to see that or have it be close? So, you know,
No, that just stays there, but you would run the houses all the way either on the outside or you group them in close proximity to have an open area.
What about terrace gardening?
sure. We could do that.
Because
but
you
it's
have
a lot
that
of
steep
slope.
stuff, so, you know, like,
I'll put some of those ideas down.
Yeah. You know, one thing we haven't talked about, and we probably should have in the town center, stone walls and things like that, that the town kind of says West Newbury.
oh, that's true, there's a
That's
lot
a
of
good
stone
point.
wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can go back and add that.
So I'm gonna put terrace gardens with stone
Stone
walls.
walls. We have lots of those, lots of stone.
If you're, I think I think an interesting question with that idea of like a public green area on this site is if it's close to the street, there's a possibility that some other folks that don't live there would know about it and would go there and use it.
Yeah.
If it's in the back of the site, it's, you know, primarily
Private.
going to be for folks in the resident,
Yeah.
most likely.
With the views. Yeah, so that sounds ideal.
So, you know, was there, with that in mind, you know, could you imagine some more public-oriented amenities in this space, or would you, this could, you know, or this could be,
That would be fantastic, but what we just identified as a problem with this site for being downtown is that the site views are very bad. There's no sidewalk on this side of town, on this side of the street. So it's not ideal for people cars coming in and out, or even people coming in and out.
right?
Unless we could ameliorate that somehow.
Oh, you mean as far as walking is concerned?
As far as walking, or even if we had some mixed use, is that what you're suggesting, like a retail thing, or?
Yeah, so like I could imagine mixed use there. You could imagine maybe a small like playground or garden. You know, like there's something that could be more public facing that's still
Right.
used by the.
I love that idea, but the problem is, as I say, that's a dangerous place. The site views are pretty bad. We were talking
Yeah,
about
so-
that with the.
So putting that house in the front, I don't think it's a good idea. I think it should be back someplace even.
Unless.
But with the site, with the driveway,
Better, yeah.
over here, rather than here. So
Yeah,
this
maybe-
is the site impediment, this steep slope and everything,
does-
is what they're saying.
I see. You know, it does look like you have some trees here and it's a little steeper slope, but maybe if you put the entrance right where that building is now, and then you get around to the straightaway a little more, and something like that, so you can have that turn.
It's been a sort of a retail space in the past because they've sold plants
Oh,
and
when they were
things that
selling
you drive
plants, I didn't
up into the parking area.
So this has 20 to 30 units in it. It's a small apartments. You know, this is a large building with small apartments in it. And we don't have to talk about, you know, there's kind of one question, which is, is this appropriate for this site at all?
Is that,
It's
not
that,
appropriate
is
for
that
West
building?
Newbury.
Look at one
Is
of
that
them,
building
20.
right there?
Those are just examples of similar scale building. And that
Which
was,
one do you want? That one?
actually, these are the ones that
Yeah.
are, yeah. These are like similar scale to
No,
what we're talking
no.
about. Yeah.
See, I don't want anything over 2 stories,
Over how many?
2 stories,
Oh, yeah.
my opinion.
Oh, those aren't over 3
These are like
stories.
2.5.
Those are 2.5.
2.5's okay, but 3,
But these are, large buildings, high density buildings. So I think there's 2 ways to approach it. We could say, no way, we don't want to have any of these types
Yeah,
of buildings.
we
And
don't
the other
want
way is to say, okay, well, assuming a developer might want to build one of these buildings, would it be better to have it close to the street or
No.
further away? Or just not at all? That they're all fair answers. So.
The big building?
The biggest.
Would you like, you could locate it close to the street and have your road, go through it? Or you could have it in the back, or you
Are
could have
these
it.
similar scale to is this correctly scaled for these buildings?
They are,
Or close?
yeah, so it's just the apartments are all smaller, that's, the
Right.
smallest,
No,
and
but
then
I
they
was
get
just
larger
thinking,
scale.
if we're thinking about like the greenhouse that's there or another building that's there, I just want to kind
It almost looks
of
like
share
something
it
like
to say,
So-
we're seeing it as a very large building, but is it
Yeah.
compatible in footprint to those two?
Right, it's a big building, it's probably similar to the
So
greenhouse.
it's compatible to the 2 greenhouses, so if we take 2 greenhouses down, put up an apartment, you've got 20 plus.
I just don't think a lot of people are going to be attracted to apartments here. We come here for rural community stuff and horses and,
So I think,
Yeah, I was gonna say, but that's what's available. But how many people would want to just get their foot in the door and say, I would love to live there, but I just can't afford it? And would they live there in those apartments?
yeah. And
Their
I-
grandchildren, or their children.
How do you afford,
And another thing on that front is with rural, I think it's a good point with the kind of rural character, because if there's 30 units in that building,
Are
and
they more likely to be affordable?
probably,
They're
I mean,
likely to
they're
be
small.
less expensive.
Less expensive, yeah.
I mean, I just feel like I wish that what we could be building are affordable units, which doesn't sound like that's the priority of this exercise, but it's my priority. So maybe a building like that.
Like that building, in terms of the number of units, you could, you have a lot of the smaller, larger floor footprint buildings, smaller buildings that have like 2 units in them. You need a lot of them to get
You
up to
need
the
a lot
similar.
of
So,
them, right.
so
I like that, if I would recommend units close together with I'm considered a play area in
Yeah,
the
it's
middle.
yeah, it's critical.
So kids can go out and that's my opinion, but, and you say you want to put one back there?
and towards
I
the
don't know
back,
who these people, they're gonna probably get upset.
They've got a good buffer there. Look at all that forest.
What if you put it, so, you have this site here, or you could have, there's potential even for some parking underneath. You could probably depending on what the ground's like under there, you could regrade it and have it next to the terrace gardens in the back.
And then in addition to some of these little,
others, yeah.
How does that sound?
yeah.
So up here, we're imagining kind of something that carries the character of the existing houses. Does that seem?
Does seem right.
But maybe with some mixed use in this area, like low key commercial space as well as housing.
I mean, if you put 20 units in there, then you have a lot of open space that you wouldn't be taken up with housing. So that's kind of
This
the
would be
beauty.
interesting.
That's kind of the beauty of it.
Be interesting,
Trails, have-
the question, what's affordability
right.
in these units? And
Yeah, and it
was
may just be, it's
These
not,
should be rental units, is that what you're thinking?
it could be rental, which makes it really a different, makes it much more affordable when it's rental.
Here's the night.
Or at least makes it more accessible because you don't have to come up with a down payment.
Right. It's a thought.
I think just because it's an apartment doesn't guarantee affordability, because I know someone
No,
that's
absolutely. Doesn't
apartment in
guarantee it.
Lawrence is like $2,000 a month. And he's got a family, he's got a wife and a child, and it's,
But he didn't have to come up with a $20,000 down payment.
Right.
So, is that being
Lawrence?
that you're getting rid of?
Interesting, Merrimack. Is Merrimack, is that
Do they have a
sewage?
requirement?
They have a sewer system there?
Oh, I don't know.
Because they have a big, large
Yeah,
senior,
I bet they do, because they do have some large, or it's got its
senior
own,
apartment complex
or it has
up on
its
the
own
hill.
system.
I don't know if you've seen that up in there.
Yeah, I haven't been there in a while, but I know they have some large buildings. I'm guessing they must have some.
Could we look and see how many of these smaller buildings we could fit, maybe with, in a view, or so that there's open
Maybe in
space
the
in the middle?
townhouse style or something?
Yeah, just see if we could fit.
I mean, there's a lot of space. You know, you
Right,
could have
there
one
really
big,
is a
you could
lot
have a
of
really big green up there that's like the
Still
size
have
of a,
some
you know, a
space.
small ball field. You could have a soccer field. Well, I mean, it's a little bit steep. You'd have to do some serious regrading, but if you
Right.
put this into the slope and imagine regrading so that you have you know, parking underneath, and then have the part that is at the top would be pretty, you know, maybe a story at the top. And then you could put some kind of configuration.
Oh, something where they have their small shared space as well.
How about something at the top where the view is ideal?
This isn't part of anything, is it? This isn't part of this.
No, it stops at this white line.
Right, okay.
About something like that. So there's sort of, and then you need parking too, but the idea of kind of like a shared, a green.
And I love that parking concept of things being behind the house.
Oh, yeah, with the alleys behind the house that gets to the parking. Yeah, that's a great idea.
In that case, maybe you have,
And how many units does that give us total?
those are, I think,
Those are, where'd they
I
go?
want to say those are 8.
6 to 12?
Confused, yeah.
6 to 12, were those 6 to 12?
I think so.
Yeah,
I think those are the 6 to 12.
so then you've got like 20 units there.
That wasn't the town.
And this is 20 to, so let's say that's 24, and let's say that's 20 units
So
there, so that's
44
44
plus you got that.
plus another 20, like that's
So we're
8,
like this.
10, 12. So you're getting on towards the, you know, that total.
Right. That's beautiful now. So would be the thought would be to try to keep that all open, or?
This back here?
Yeah.
I wouldn't keep it all open.
This would be open
You
space.
wouldn't, or you would?
No, I would
You
not.
wouldn't? You would build it out?
I would build it, I would rather see some, like,
Make it
open
into a
spaces.
community.
Give the homes a little more space, individual space, you mean?
And open, like you give this
Like
little
here,
open
so-
area here, but,
Got ya.
It's kind of tight.
Have the
It's kind of tight
driveways
there, though.
I guess,
in the back, so there's a lot more room, we could fit more houses. I think this Dunn property is the one
To develop?
focus on, I really do.
I think those are crowded, though, you know, I'm used to seeing things with more space.
So let's say you had,
Homes.
let's say you have kind of one field, and then you have another field with its kind
Yeah.
of like its.
And
Yeah.
each of those have to have their own
Access?
septic, I
Right.
guess.
Oh, septic. Oh, really?
I mean,
No, so that's not developed, that's just.
not each house, but each group.
Yeah.
so this is the high area, this is the high
That's
area?
the highest part there. Yeah.
So that's where the views are.
Yeah.
So I would, I would definitely have your houses up in this
Yeah.
area here, and your systems up, down in this area here someplace.
Well, you're thinking about the way water flows, aren't you? I love it.
How
You
about
might
something?
get all 87 if you leave those.
How about something like that? So you've got like a little mixed-use center, and then this is sort of like agricultural
cluster.
setup. So a little cluster here with a bigger building.
He wants more,
No,
more
that's all
houses.
right, that's,
You're good with that?
yeah, something like that.
That could be a vegetable garden, a group, a joint.
A what?
Or could you do
What
gardening
if you
this way?
did, you know, these
Oh, let's do
greenhouses here? What if that became like a community garden area? You have your terrace gardens there, which is possible.
Yeah.
This seems like a lot of space, but I don't know what a lot of space is.
I would
Yeah.
put something there.
Well,
Another
this is, see the size of this right here is that mixed-use building.
All these people.
With all that,
Yeah.
that's that commercial.
Is that
building.
291 Main Street?
No, this is that's Main Street right there.
Right, yeah.
This is Crane Neck Street.
Yeah, so that's gotta be 291 right there.
This is Crane Neck.
So,
Oh, no, that's part of done.
so this is 1 inch equals 40 feet, so like 80, 120. So like a soccer field's kind of like about that size.
There you go, you knew exactly what to say. It's a soccer field.
There's nothing, these are all, well, that's got some stuff back there. I didn't even know he had stuff back there.
So, yeah, that's that little mixed-use commercial building, isn't it, with the,
I don't know what's there. I
used to
don't
have the
know.
driving school in it?
No,
Is that what that is?
Isn't that the apartment building? Not apartment.
No. This is Noonan's, right?
Yeah, that's 291 Main.
Yeah.
This is
And this here is Crane Neck. It's Crane Neck, okay? That's Crane Neck Auto there. And these,
No, that's Maple Street.
no,
Yeah.
this isn't Dunn's property, is it? This
Yes.
is, which one's this one?
This is Town Center.
Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
Dun.
I'm lost.
That's
You
all
know, I
right.
was thinking, I thought we were starting to talk about the Dunn
Yes.
over by.
So that's what that is.
This is Dunn property.
Yeah,
Oh,
so that
okay.
is that little commercial
Right,
strip,
I'm
right?
sorry.
No, you're good.
Okay,
So I'm just thinking of, that's a pretty good-sized building, and it's only that big.
that's
So
Maple Street.
there's a fair amount of space here for sure.
So you feel good about this? So we've got, I mean, I think it's pretty clear concept where you have a little center by the street that's got some mixed use in it, and then you have maybe the most
Yeah,
dense
that's a
center
good-
there,
that's a good idea.
built
They've
into
got
the
big-
slope.
But they've got
Yeah.
a big
There's
amount of
some-
space.
Field with some amenities and using that slope for some gardens.
And a smaller grouping.
Do what it does
there.
naturally.
You could probably
you know?
build some more, as you say.
Yeah,
somehow
more units.
configure, But
More
definitely
units.
allow for some type of,
How can we get this building to take advantage of the view? Well, back there, those should be taken advantage of, I guess.
You know, this is
So there's two vistas, excuse me, there's two vistas, one here and here? Is that what that is? Yeah. I don't know whose that is, yeah.
What goes on behind these houses? What's all this?
So interestingly enough, possibility of, excuse me.
I don't know what's there.
Expansion?
Maybe there's something to that where you kind of have your big building that sort of retains the slope a bit. You could put some parking in it. So once you get up the hill, then it's a smaller building compared to this sort of green.
Similar scale.
And then this slopes up
Yeah.
a bit more, and then you've got some smaller buildings up there. So this has views from the top floors. Potentially, I mean, they're looking this way. There's into the woods.
To the community garden.
Yeah, into the garden. Yeah, or you could kind of put it at an angle so it has views that way. But, you know, something along those lines. So it has take up the slope there. The sex kind of retains this upper green, and then that has views out that way.
Yeah.
Which seems pretty nice. And then you've got another cluster out there.
Yeah.
And then protect the farm fields as much as possible. It's kind of
Yeah.
And all these people can walk into town, into the coffee shop.
Really?
The future coffee shop or the one we have now?
Bakery.
That's really nice.
Yeah.
and parking underneath as much as possible, but we're behind
Right.
this
Yeah.
area.
Yeah,
So
Sort of like that.
And you could use this area over here for your community gardens if you wanted to take 8 or 12 feet of it to do little small gardens.
I could move right in.
There you go.
for
I
open
think Kevin was gonna move in too. He's over here somewhere.
great. So are there?
Where'd he go?
I think he had to leave.
So I think that's awesome. Are there some other connections that would be important at this site? Like for you said that the access to the site for folks walking is pretty bad. There's not.
Treacherous.
You have to cross the street to.
You'd have to have a crosswalk across there, but once you get across the street,
crosswalk would have to be put in, but
there's
This
a
could be, this
sidewalk.
could be very walkable,
Does Daily
right?
Drive have a
Yeah.
crosswalk across the street? Do they have a crossing
No,
there?
they don't.
Daily Drive?
Daily Drive, no.
No,
No,
they
they
don't have a crossing. Yep.
They do.
Oh, they do?
They have
They
a
do?
crosswalk across from there?
But not with a light and everything. Is that
No,
what you
no
mean?
light.
Yes, they
They have a
do.
mark?
It's by the
They have a
Brazilian
marked area?
soldiers. I think so, yeah, because I crossed
I
it the
better
other
look
day.
again. I don't remember it.
Yeah,
So,
when I drive by.
I don't remember it.
yeah,
What is that?
I'm pretty sure they do have a crosswalk there
Okay.
now.
Is that
Yeah, those interesting, the new report crossing systems. They have those,
Of the self,
yeah,
the
put
lights.
it in the
Yeah.
lights.
Yeah, that's a pretty, on that street, that's a pretty busy street too.
Yeah.
Although I'm
113.
surprised at how busy 113 is when
Yes,
I
it
go
is.
home at 4:30.
Yes, it is.
Well,
Yeah,
it is
there's a lot of
busy there.
traffic there.
People most likely be walking from this side.
No.
There's no,
No
well, there's
sidewalk.
no sidewalk on that side, right at this point.
On this
so-
side.
If there were a sidewalk, would you think people would? Is there anywhere to walk from?
I think this.
I don't think you
what
don't
they've
have the
said,
space
you
to
can
put it
do
in.
here.
Yeah, because you have that gas station, or well, mechanic station
Yeah,
there.
the gas stations. There's the,
Right
that's the
there.
that
A lot
gas
of
station
kids
right
walk
there.
No, on this
downtown
side.
the high school.
Yeah, nope, next, right there.
Yeah, it's a gas station.
Oh, yeah, that's a big amount of,
He has no parking really.
Boy,
It's pretty wide right away.
It's funny
I'd be
how
shocked
the-
if you couldn't fit a sidewalk somewhere.
that used to be a great shop for selling all types of tools. We, lawnmowers and chainsaws. When I first moved.
So if you were to say, if possible, some kind of sidewalk. All right. Well, thank you.
We
That
didn't
was
work
a
on that
very
one.
clear concept.
We didn't work on that one.
We did that before.
Oh, you guys?
Yeah, yeah. I like that one. Where's the back?
I like this done part the best.
So we've done them all now.
My name's Nate, and the goal for this station is a modeling station. Have you done the other modeling station?
Yep.
Yeah. So you kind of have the general idea. This is the Dunn property here. This is Main Street. North is roughly this way. And then this is the Nat property, and that's north is roughly that way with Main Street on that side. This is about 15 acres. That's about 19 acres. This site, this is all wetlands down here, so about half the site. So about half the site is wetlands. So if you multiply 15 times 15, it's 225, and it's like 285 on that site. But since half of it's wetlands, it'd really be about half that, so 140 units. However, as you probably talked about previously, there are other constraints with septic that make it so that really more than 90 is probably not particularly realistic. And so the exercise here is thinking about what principles you'd like to see to organize space with new development on either site. And I think aiming for between like 40 and 90 units is probably reasonable enough for this exercise. So we've done, the first group did 2 sites in parallel. The second group did each site but in sequence, and the most recent group picked one. All that's fair game. I think that it's a little easier if we pick one if there's one that you're really excited about exploring. It probably would be better to start there and work together.
We were just kind of looking at this piece of property. It might be easiest to transition right there.
Okay.
To start.
Does everyone agree? Does that seem good? Okay. So you can see this previous group's ideas was to have a few different centers to protect some of the sort of agricultural character of the site by having several denser clusters around kind of a center green, some community-oriented amenities, and a little bit more mixed-use center along the street that was had a relatively low-density appearance from the street. There's a steep slope here, so most of the site is not actually visible from the road. Really, this area would be the only part of the site that's going to be particularly visible for folks passing the site. So for your group, maybe we could start by talking about what things you'd like to keep or protect, and what things you think definitely should be removed or changed. That's not, there we go. So, this is, I think, a greenhouse, a house, a garage type building, and some greenhouses on the site, the done site.
I think unless you really want to get into expensive earthwork, you have to preserve this as your access. I don't think you can build right over the top of that.
In terms of the access, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if I think there's the potential of having, knocking that down and having a new building of some sort here. Might even be able to kind of do this sort of an angled thing, and maybe even sneak in another one there. But this has got to be your main access.
So, with that in mind, so this is in the sort of 8 to 10 area for a number of units, and then this is a duplex. This has 20 to 30 units in. It's like 24. So, along the street, would you rather see something that is a smaller, duplex or 8 to 10 units, or something that is a larger? No.
Well, what about a mixed use up front? Because we're right downtown, with commercial on the bottom and apartments on the top, on the street side.
The concern I have with that is we've got a lot of vacancy right here for commercial, and I don't know if I just don't see us supporting it now.
Right. So maybe if it were supportable, maybe the question being, if there was a spot on the site to do mixed use, would it be there? Then the developer could decide whether they thought it was viable, within their development plan. Or
one of the things that you mentioned before, and then I'll back away because I feel like I'm talking too much at this thing. But I like that idea of smaller units as far as kind of blending into what already exists along Main Street. I like mixed use idea. I think is great. And that would also, you've got to have some parking around here for the residents and the commercial use.
But only 2 stories down there, I think, right?
2 stories or 2.5 kind of thing, like what we've already got along here.
Right, and you got some big houses that
there are some bigger houses.
You could match.
Yeah. I think there's the potential right here in this kind of low spot to do another community, maybe even higher density apartments and whatnot. The potential, I think, a selling point to the town. I think there's a potential here to have a really nice park because you're up so high. I imagine the views from up here are fantastic. I haven't walked up there, I don't know. But I imagine the views are fantastic, and this could be a nice place for a park.
Could you imagine that being, there's plenty of space up there. That park could be like a central green with houses around it, or it could just be a park with some parking. Which one of those?
In my mind, the only problem with building up here is that I think everybody will see these buildings because it's so high. Maybe if they're set back, that's not true because you've sort of got a tabletop thing going on here. But I think a place for a lot of building would be down in here. And then again, I think.
And is this not buildable, Ray? I mean, can that also be built upon that whole area?
I think that's.
That whole
I'm
area?
just looking at it, and I'm thinking, yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of gets at what you protect and what to remain. Like you can cut down trees, so there are larger trees there. So you could, we could.
I guess you
consider
really
that.
need to get on the
keep
property
some of
and then
this
take a
just to
look at
buffer
it.
these people.
And see what's happening there.
Yeah.
Ray, any visibility you've got from that high part would be from 1 or 2 spots along here, because this is so steep and it's fully treed. You don't see anything. You're looking right into a steep
I
slope.
suspect you're exactly right. I just don't. I know that it's always a tricky business when you build on the top of a hill. And I know what you're saying.
But from these sides, yeah. But here you're probably right.
I'm just wondering, I haven't walked up here, I'm just wondering, I mean, if this is a beautiful hilltop with, you know, you're seeing right across the Merrimack River into New Hampshire and stuff, that would be a nice thing to help. I think there's gonna be a lot of hesitation at town meeting to doing any of this, but if you can show that everybody in town would benefit from a, you know, a nice open public park with great views.
So how about like a meadow and public trails and a green, something like that?
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
But protecting,
you know, an accessible place
protecting
that
the
people could get up
hillside
there as well.
and the view shed.
You know, older folks and people in wheelchairs and whatnot, that, you know, have a
I mean,
place
as a
to.
practical matter, once you zone this, how do you think we're going to control this?
Well, I mean,
Or inform the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't want to say like, you know, let's wait till the next phase, but I think it is important to have a vision for what you think would be good, and then we can take it from there to see what is feasible. We do have open space standards for other types of projects that we've included, and so there are opportunities to at least state what's desired, and then, you know, to what degree it has teeth to it, I guess depends on
So
how.
I guess listening to you, I'm thinking if we were to have open space standards that the state would allow, right? Then why wouldn't the state take that acreage out of the calculation?
Right.
I agree with Hope, and they really want to just
This
improve
property's
those two properties right over there.
Well, you know, it's a great point. I think that if we could set that aside for the moment and say, if it were feasible to put together standards to encourage, you know, having some larger open space areas that are protected and have public or semi-public amenities. Folks agree that would be good, and then we could think about what that's.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, Ray, I mean, this is probably, this is almost, I think, a 3-story house, isn't it? It's like under.
I don't even know that.
And you can't see it almost ever.
Yeah, we never know what was
And
up
it's
there.
quite high. So I'm wondering, really, whether we would see this, other than from across the Merrimack.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think
maybe not.
Probably not from the street. Well, I would say almost certainly not from the street.
Not from the street, right.
This slope is like a wall.
So I'm thinking if we can't see it from any of the properties around or from the street, then what do we care?
All I'm saying is that, I mean, if it is beautiful up there,
Right.
it'd be a nice amenity for the town.
You're right.
I think a related question, which maybe kind of gets at your earlier question, would be the big decision between allowing higher density or not is that, you know, if you have 24 units in this and you put that there, that potentially you get to the same goal as having, you know, 5 or 6 of those buildings.
But we have this in town.
Right.
We don't really have this.
Nichols Village is what that is.
So, but I think that it kind of gets at that balance between open space, because if the goal is if we know that they're unlikely to be able to feasibly put in more than probably 40, but 90 units on the site, and you could put 90 units there, then this all would be protected by, you know, kind of.
That'd be for that.
It would be.
Yeah, if you can.
It would be inevitable.
If you can do that.
Right. Yeah. So, but I think that's the key decision there is, you know, with density comes sort of inevitable. There's more open space potential. So, so you know, with that in mind, you know, I think that it sounds like kind of have this idea of a smaller mixed-use center here. Maybe the idea of, if possible, keeping this open. Yeah, and then the sort of medium density. So these are the sort of 8 to 10 units. This is like a duplex.
Or you could do all of this.
Right.
Have it all together, cluster.
Right. So.
But I guess this is a demographic question, I guess, as much as anything. And I don't know the answer. Is there really a market for 40 units of this kind of housing in West Newbury? We have no public transportation.
Right.
And we have no real employers close by. So
The problem with those is those have to be surrounded by asphalt.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, there's a certain amount of parking that you've got to have because we don't have public transportation. And here at least, you know, you're down to individual driveways, extra lots, parking along the road. Whereas here, I think you're starting to look like some of the big complexes in Newburyport.
So, yeah, and you know, these are some pictures of the kind of scale here. It's like 2.5, 3-story.
Yeah, but where's the parking?
I know.
Yeah,
So I was thinking,
and so
where's parking?
I think that the last group actually had an interesting idea that of if you use some of the topography on the site and imagine building the first floor with parking, you know, then maybe there's some potential to hide the.
I mean, under the building.
Under the building, yep, and build into the slope so that at the top of the slope, it's, you know, a 1.5-story, 2-story building.
2 stories on top.
That's creative.
Yeah, that is creative.
And, you know, I think that there's some, strikes me as being possible or potentially possible in here, or even on that side where there's a steeper slope.
Well, I like that idea. If you're going to do one of those bigger buildings, parking on the ground floor.
So, I think.
I mean, that's expensive. I think
right.
You're talking about, I don't know what the number used to be. A parking garage is like $25,000 a spot.
Right. Yeah, it's not cheap.
And you lose the space of the building.
Right.
Yeah.
For older folks, they have to go up a whole story just to get to their living space.
Now you've got to have
And then you have
elevators.
young families, and you've got the upstairs, go up with equipment.
This is closer to the town.
Yeah, they get to the living
Okay.
space.
You're right.
We're not talking about singles, so, you know.
Right, I figured that. I was like, what are we talking
So-
about?
That's
And I
where we're at.
So it sounds to me that they're.
Accommodating some of the people that don't have housing around here now. It's the elders and young families.
Right, we don't need 3-bedroom units. We need 1-bedroom or studios, because that's the mix we don't have in town.
Right, but they have to be accessible, so having to go up a story just to get in.
Right.
But do these 3-story units, buildings generally have elevators?
Yeah, I mean, you could put an elevator. The benefit of having a building with apartments is that it's going to be, they might be expensive, but the more units you have per building, the more money there is within the budget, presumably, to do things like having an elevator or putting parking underneath,
Yeah, because you
things
have
like
to,
that. So,
elevators are expensive, you got to divide that cost per unit.
so if I could summarize what I'm hearing, I think it's like there are real questions about whether there's a market for smaller units, and whether, you know, particularly expensive smaller units, and on the site whether it would be good. So for those reasons, it seems like the most logical thing, or what seems like most expected, would be that you might have these sort of medium density buildings, duplexes, and apartments that are 6 to 10 units. But if there were if there were a building that and a developer that felt like there was a market for it, and it could have an elevator and maybe have parking underneath and ways to really minimize the scale of the building, you might be open to it.
Also, you didn't mention the idea, you know, like 2-story townhouses.
Right.
You know, I mean, you have 6 or 7 of these in a row.
Well, like, yeah, these are townhouse size. So if you had some like townhouse, and this has you could put parking underneath the townhouse. Yeah, you can do that on.
At least they'd be more clustered. You could save some of the open space.
You got a fire in one, you got 4 families out in the street.
Well, I mean, you do have the firewalls between.
Yeah, if we're talking about writing zoning ordinances, I think it's important to have in it that the open space will be available for public trails and access.
Okay.
Because that's not always the case.
Right.
It has not been always the case.
Yep.
All the way to, okay.
Could you hand me that other townhouse little blob there? Thank you.
It's like Monopoly.
Yeah.
So many of those garden style things.
So,
And that's why they all go up.
with all that in mind, you know, let's say, just for the sake of,
You really like those big apartment buildings, don't you?
it really, actually, I don't, but I do think that the reason why I bring it up is because it's sort of the key question for this is what is the maximum density that's why I bring it up, because.
Yeah. I mean, these look very nice, but they do get tall. I think if you put it back here, I don't think there's going to be any objection from anybody except whoever owns that house.
Especially if this is a low elevation.
Exactly. You've tucked this whole thing down. That makes access, the road, the cost of developing the road and everything less expensive. I don't know how you deal with the sewage treatment here.
Right.
Right, that's a key detail.
Is this a road in
here?
So, right. So
I'm assuming that this perks really well. I assume this perks beautiful.
So
put up here.
Right. So to that end, in terms of the design of it, I could imagine this as one road, lined with houses, or you could imagine it as, something that has more of a green along the center, and those are, pretty different. Which one would you prefer? You think?
I don't think this belongs there at all. Not if you're doing that kind of layout.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like it belongs there.
Could that accommodate all
Yeah,
87
exactly.
units?
Maybe somewhere else.
Which is what we got.
Yeah, so does this get you 87 units?
Oh, easily, yeah. So that's 25. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 35. I figured those are 16, 32. So that's like more than 90.
6 or 7.
And is that on? Yeah, so this is more than 90.
Okay, so it could be one site.
So
The one with the sewage, septic stuff.
Right. And so then for septic, that's the distinction here being that if you have like all along one road, you could put the septic off to use one of these open space areas as also the site for the septic, or you could. A lot of people there's a larger green in the center where you put the septic. So.
And we haven't talked about water anywhere.
Water's going to be a challenge anywhere.
What's that? It's going to be a problem? Or?
Yeah, because I mean we have the water line running along here, but our water line is kind of at its max capacity right now.
Right.
But that's true everywhere in town.
Right.
Time for a moratorium.
So you don't use the toilet or you don't drink water. You make a choice.
I don't have an answer on the water for the moment, but I do wonder,
That fire flow analysis and water supply analysis, that's done with every development.
Yeah.
And sometimes it means the developer has to pay for upgrading, some of the supply lines and whatnot.
Right.
Do we have the capacity for that kind of water, for that kind of concentrated?
I'm guessing the way it is now, no.
Just asking.
So, just to summarize where we're at, what I'm hearing, I think we have this sorted out, and it seems like there's kind of a move towards having maybe, if there was going to be a larger building, certainly it would be at the very back, and it would be kind of tucked out of the way, or at the end of maybe one road with like septic and open space to the side.
I think you gotta have some sort of a loop here. Because you gotta be able to get lots of equipment in and around.
Parking behind it, if not under.
So you have this idea of the townhouses. Where do you think those should go? Any thoughts? Closer to the front, as like together or one-sided?
I don't know. I think you want to stick with the theme.
Uh-huh.
Like maybe all of these are townhouses. Maybe all of these are the smaller units.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, up here, I think you've got real potential to do something fun and interesting.
Right.
Could you have a plan where this is off by itself somewhere? Because I'm guessing that people who want to live in townhomes don't necessarily want to live next to a 3-story apartment building.
Mm-hmm. Well, it could be in
small. That's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah,
like down
up
here
there by the main street.
Yeah.
Okay.
Down here.
Or even, way up there.
Right.
And those are one-bedroom apartments.
Or as
so
we were
people come
talking,
and go.
push it out into this property.
Mm-hmm.
There's a potential
Knowing that owner, he's probably willing to sell
over
it.
here.
Right.
To bring that into the equation.
Yeah, I just don't see that big thing. Small.
Right. So let's say, we've got the street, maybe, and then at the end it loops back, and there's like some kind of public-oriented space along that side. So there's kind of a double-sided street. There's the kind of a theme for so you have the smaller apartments, larger building at one end. You have some townhouse area, sort of larger apartments area.
You gotta be more realistic about what's going to be required for the width of your road here.
This is a 20. Those are each 12-foot lanes, and with a sidewalk on it. This is 1 inch equals 40 feet. So you could fit. 40 foot would allow for 2 lanes, 5-foot sidewalk on either side, and a tree belt. So you could.
And no green space in front of the building at all.
Right. So if you wanted to have like a large lawn,
you gotta give yourself not a large lawn necessarily, but something.
Mm-hmm. So I hear some medium-sized lawns, maybe in front of these.
So you're doing parking in back or parking along the road in front on these?
It's kind of imagining. Well, these would have parking underneath it, I think.
Oh, okay.
And then, what do you all think? I mean, I kind of would be inclined to put the parking behind, but.
And I think a lot of trees.
You don't want to just
a lot of trees and mixed species, so we don't run into that.
Yeah, I'd say limited lawn and a lot of trees.
You've got
Some native forests.
which can't probably be more than
And then parking behind, that's what I was hearing.
And then you go all the way over to this daily drive.
Maybe here in the flat ground, it's lower.
You don't,
and then having some distributed parking around the back.
With the Mullins project, there's a couple other.
Generally behind.
Not that being up kind of on the road and all the parking behind.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a separate development almost than this tree-lined street.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say eliminate as much lawn, and then you could still have a community garden area.
Okay. Would you like to see that as kind of more of a green at this end, or?
We're trying to lose lawns around here.
Yeah, lawns are just a wasted.
I agree.
Space.
Pollinator gardens.
That's what we need is pollinator gardens.
Are you willing to be done?
How are you all feeling? Are you feeling like we're wrapping
We're
up?
willing to be done.
Okay.
Is it perfect?
I think so.
Well, the land was perfect, but now we've kind of put all of these structures on it. So.
Yeah, I think we've got some ideas, so we're good.
I really like the part up front.
Yeah. Just that would be good.
Yeah, that would be very good.
So we're going to wrap it up now, folks. If you all want to just sort of gather around the central table here, we'll sing Kumbaya and let you go home. Has anybody got a pitch?
Yeah, I didn't know that was on the program.
Feel free to sit down if you want. You want to come over this way?
So I'll plan to move
Oh, that's nice of you to say.
Yeah, that's
so fun. Sometimes we have an
All right, what's after 9? We promised that you have. What were they promised, like 8:30?
No, 9.
9? All right, so we don't feel too bad.
Right.
So yeah, we were originally planning for like a half-hour discussion, more questions and stuff. So we'll let you go home very briefly, but I think we want to give everybody a chance to reflect and maybe reinforce anything that you'd like to make sure that we've heard. or that you think other people should hear, or to say something you thought was a really great idea you hadn't thought of, or a really bad idea?
I got something.
Go ahead.
Just shout out to Dodson and Flinker Associates for putting on a really, really wonderful workshop. Y'all did a great job facilitating a tough topic.
You won't object to hearing that?
It's easy with good participants.
Yes, you were excellent. Excellent participants. Which site do you think makes the most sense to develop? If you didn't own one, should we develop all of them to some extent? One of them to a greater extent? And which one would it be?
Yeah, I don't think this all has to be solved with just one parcel. I think there's an opportunity to like zone several parcels and then let the market decide how best to go at it.
Yeah.
I agree with Ray. Every one of these lots we considered has vacant land next to it, but we kind of excluded from the discussion that should be really part of the zoning discussion.
Right, so extending the base of land to sort of logical extents rather than just one parcel.
For instance, the Dunn's property, Dave Dennis owns the property next to it, and Brad owns the next one to that, and then it goes to the Daily property. It goes to the whole three of them. And that's all they consider together.
So I think one thing that I think that I'm hearing is that you guys are not interested in just fulfilling the requirements, that you actually might want some housing to result from it. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think definitely some of us feel that way. I'm not sure if that's. But definitely some of us do.
By a show of hands, who actually wants housing to result from this? All right. So.
But I'd like to qualify mine.
Yeah.
That we have this 40B requirement, which, I think we're like 1%. And I'd like to see whatever we build get us closer to 4 or 5%. Then get to the 10%. But any development we hear where there's 1 or 2 or 4 units or 5%, that's not helping us. Whereas if we do this together and work on both requirements, maybe we can get towards a 5% or something a lot better than we are right now.
Yeah, I'd like to second what Rick said. I'd be interested in exploring more about 40R so that we can meet the state requirement, but we can also get more affordable housing for the buck.
At town meeting, I hear about, and I've just been here for 10 years, about people who've grown up here who have to leave because they have a big house and they can't afford to live here, and they don't necessarily need affordable housing by a low income standard, but they need something they can afford that's reasonable, and young families that would love to live closer to their parents and can't live in the area. And something that would allow that group, as well as the people who have income needs, to be accommodated in a reasonable way. I guess that's my goal.
To follow up on that, we have a lot of 3, 4, 5 bedroom housing in this town. What we're really short on is studios and 1 bedroom units for the starter and for the downsizing people.
Every town we work on, it's the same issue and people realize it, but when you come to change the zoning, they say, oh, we don't want apartments, we don't want townhouses, that's not us. So from what you've heard here tonight, do you think it's possible to convince town meeting that this is a good idea? At least on a limited basis, on maybe three parcels or something like that? How do we make that argument? Or I guess from what you've heard tonight, what's the
best argument you can make?
Yeah, or what's the best example?
I think it's an aggregate argument, which is number one, what Rich just said, and number two, that
stick, or a series of sticks related to the Amputee Communities Act. And we're going to feel some pain if we don't respond. You know, it seems to me that they're two driving forces.
I think if you're along Main Street and, or some of the visible, if you got visible buildings, I don't think you want to depart too much from the existing architecture in town that much. But there's, on the lots we looked at, there's potential in the back part of the lot and whatnot, where you can get some of the increased density, townhouses, even the larger buildings. But people will be concerned. And then, of course, there's just the constraint of septic and water. Yeah, water's going to be an issue everywhere.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has to be conveyed is that just because this, and I know this question is probably been discussed ad nauseam tonight, but just because the zoning might be changed, or just if it were changed, doesn't mean that next year, 97 units or 87 units, whatever the number, 87 units are going to drop out of the sky. It's going to be a long process, and very probably large increments, but incremental. And, I think it's important that if this gets to town meeting, it's going to happen, that being made. This is like the town is all of a sudden going to see 5% more housing next year.
Yeah, I think what you can maybe look at, we can work with you for the next few months to integrate that desire to meet the requirements of MBTA, but also the town's desire to have that message of we need more smaller units for people. That message will resonate, and we haven't obviously time to get that promulgated to folks. But people want that. They hear it with affordable housing, which doesn't always mean you're meeting state mandates, but you're meeting a need, and that need is smaller units for people. So I'm optimistic this is a great meeting tonight, and I think there's a lot of good takeaways.
So next time we're going to have another 4,000 people.
Angus, did you have
talk
a?
about units, they need to be homes.
Homes.
If we talk about units, people have, they frame it as an apartment and the stereotype, we need to call these homes, places for people to live.
It's a good point.
I can't call them affordable stacked flat dwelling units.
I think in terms of the elected leadership of this town, both the select board and the planning board, I think it's the responsibility of those boards, and they've really risen to it in a big way to make the best effort to bring the best, most thoughtful proposal they can or we can to the voters. But it really is up to the voters. So while I think it's great for people to advocate one side or the other, I think it's really important to not try to do a hard sell on this. I think people need to understand the pros and the cons, and every voter is going to decide for themselves whether they think the proposal that ends up getting to town meeting is in the best interest of the town. And I think, people need to be given the space to make that decision based on full information. I think there's a lot of us in the community who are supportive of housing generally and very cognizant of the need that this would fill. We are working in the context of a state mandate, which is really a different thing than the state has ever done in the history of the Commonwealth, this kind of mandate. So I just think, I would personally rather see a great proposal brought to the town, and everyone vote. I mean, I'd like to see it pass, but I'd hate to see it become acrimonious, and I have seen that in other communities, and where one side is vilified or the other. So I just think it's important to get everybody involved, get everyone informed. Everyone will make their decision, and ultimately the town will speak. And if it doesn't pass it, there will be penalties. Support for people to know that. But I just think it's we need to avoid becoming the state's kind of heavy. It's like, oh, you have to do this. It's like, well,
I think I appreciate what you're saying. I think the problem here is, like, we're looking at, you know, we're kind of rearranging little houses and whatnot, but what we're really talking about is a zoning change. And you're bringing that to the town, and if somebody at town meeting says, well, are you gonna build that? We can't, well, we don't know. We're just changing the zoning, the actual proposal for what it would look like, how it would be built, where are the public paths and all that. That we don't know. And once it's rezoned, we lose a lot of control over that.
That argues for rezoning one parcel and not multiple parcels, to me. And I think town meeting would rather hear that there's one parcel to be the great experiment, and then see what happens.
I beg to differ. I think just saying spot zoning on one parcel is not proper urban planning. It's trying to put a square peg in a round hole.
Right, but this is responding to a state mandate. This did not bubble up from the citizenry.
The next step for the state is going to be to say you can't qualify for open space preservation grants.
I don't think that's responsible. I mean,
Well,
we're
they're saying you
responding
can't
to,
qualify for MassWorks grants. You know, why
Brett, we're addressing a
why
state
reward
mandate.
communities like West Newbury with open space preservation funds if they're not going to provide equitable housing opportunities for everyone in the Commonwealth?
We're attempting to meet that mandate, Brett.
Very narrowly per your instruction, Patricia.
One of the other points I like to make, you know, in our form of government, town government, it's very difficult to pass something like this in a town meeting. So is this something we could bypass the town meeting and go to a general overall vote and the town where everybody votes on it?
That'd be nice.
Where I think, you know, as soon as the town meeting, the appropriate people that are involved in the issue are close to it, will show up and vote whatever it is down. So it's pretty near impossible to pass something of this nature at town meeting.
Well, I will say, people show up at town meeting when they're passionate about whatever the topic is.
Right.
And this is one where I think you'll get a lot of attendance at town meeting.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think Angus's point is having the conversations first. I mean, so often, this has kind of been forced on you, but we see this a lot of towns, even without the MBTAs. A small group of people understands what needs to happen and say, let's change the zoning. And they get a grant to change the zoning, and then they come to town meeting, and everyone is like, what is going on? So hopefully this is also a demonstration of the kind of work that you need to do, is to help people understand and think about what kind of place do we want West Newbury to be, and to sketch that out and come up with some kind of a vision. How does development help or hinder the future of our town center? How does it fit into each neighborhood in the town? To think about that stuff first, just like, what do we want? And then to say, well, this is zoning going to help us or hurt us? And if we can't convince ourselves that the zoning is going to be a positive thing, then we have a problem.
I agree 100% with, and just how you're going about this, I think is exactly the right way. But one thing that I thought was just an incredible takeaway from the news article that was, I think, in today's paper on the demographics and the small percentage of households in the town that are, I think, between 20 and 35, something like that, and the projection that was going to fall to something like 15%. I think that's, you know, that speaks to your point of kind of what kind of community does West Newbury want to be. I think those demographic projections, if the town doesn't do something to diversify the housing stock and the range of the price points, I think that's going to open a lot of eyes.
So we're going to leave with a charge for you all, which is to talk to other people about this. As Angus said, in a not acrimonious way, you listen to other people, talk to people who may not agree with you, and just get that conversation going so that, you know, eventually eventually when it gets to town meeting, it's not all like, what? What's 15 units? What's multifamily? What are you talking about? Is this going to get built? You know, and start to hear what the perspectives are. And you can share those with Sue, or you can share them with us, so we know what the conversation is as it develops over time.
Is it majority to pass at town meeting, or is it 2/3?
Majority.
That's right, yeah, historically, it would have been 2/3 of the zoning change, but now it's.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Take some food.
Thank you all.